Hey guys, tonight we begin with a very simple question. What would you absolutely refuse to do for a living? Maybe your current job has a terrible commute. Maybe your manager sends emails at strange hours. Maybe you have to sit through meetings that could have been messages. And perhaps, every now and then, you look at your screen and quietly wonder whether medieval peasants really had it worse. Well, yes, quite often they did. So tonight, dim the lights a little. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let the room become quiet around you. And if you're already lying in bed, that's even better. Because we're going to spend the next little while drifting through medieval Europe and looking at some of the jobs that were unpleasant, filthy, dangerous, exhausting, poorly paid, or simply so strange that you might be grateful for whatever you're doing tomorrow morning. This isn't going to be a heroic journey. There will be no great battles. No kings charging dramatically across a field. No mysterious assassin waiting behind a curtain. Instead, we'll spend some time with the people who cleaned the streets, emptied the toilets, worked around dead animals, handled sewage, carried heavy loads, dug graves, and performed the many small tasks that allowed medieval towns to function without anyone having the faintest idea what bacteria were, which was probably just as well. Because once you start thinking about medieval sanitation too carefully, bedtime becomes somewhat more difficult. So let's begin quietly. Imagine a medieval town. It is early morning. The sun is only beginning to appear above the roofs. The streets are narrow, uneven, and usually unpaved. Houses lean toward one another. Wooden balconies hang over the lanes. Somewhere nearby, a bell is ringing. There are carts moving slowly through the streets. A baker is preparing bread. A blacksmith is already awake. And somewhere beneath all of this ordinary activity is a problem that every medieval town had to deal with. Waste. Lots of it. Human waste, animal waste, kitchen waste, spoiled food, dirty water ash, straw, bones, and whatever else people decided they no longer wanted. Modern cities hide most of this from us. We flush a toilet, and the problem disappears. Or at least it disappears from our immediate field of vision, which is really all we ask as civilization. Medieval people didn't have that luxury, and somebody had to deal with the mess. That brings us to one of the less glamorous occupations of medieval Europe, the night soil worker. The phrase night soil sounds rather poetic. It was not. Night soil was human waste collected from privies and cesspits. In towns where people had private or shared latrines, those pits eventually filled. And when they filled, someone had to empty them. That someone might be a specialized worker, a laborer hired by a household, or a person associated with local sanitation arrangements. The job could involve climbing down into cesspits and removing the accumulated material by hand or with simple tools. There was no rubber glove. There was no disinfectant. There was certainly no little bottle of lavender-scented sanitizer waiting nearby. The worker would remove the waste, place it into containers, and carry it away. Sometimes the material could be used as fertilizer, which makes perfect practical sense. It also makes perfect medieval sense that something unpleasant could immediately become useful. Medieval agriculture needed fertilizer, and human and animal waste could be valuable when properly managed. The problem was that properly managed was not always the phrase that came to mind when looking at a medieval street. In many towns, sanitation was a constant concern. Municipal authorities sometimes created regulations concerning waste disposal, drainage, slaughterhouses, animals, and the cleanliness of streets. Rules could forbid people from throwing certain kinds of waste into public spaces. People did it anyway. Of course they did. A regulation is only as effective as the person standing around enforcing it. And medieval towns had plenty of other things to worry about. So imagine being a worker whose livelihood depended on entering places nobody else wanted to enter. You wait before dawn. You gather your equipment. You walk through streets that are still quiet. You arrive at a house. Someone opens the door. You are not greeted with applause. Nobody says, "Wonderful, you're here." You simply get to work. And when the work is finished, you leave carrying something that everyone else was extremely happy not to carry. It was an essential occupation. It was also the kind of occupation that could carry social stigma. Medieval society had a complicated relationship with dirty work. People understood that these tasks were necessary. But understanding that something is necessary does not mean wanting to be associated with it. That distinction appears again and again throughout medieval working life. The same pattern can be seen with another occupation, the tanner. Now, tanning leather sounds much more respectable. Leather was extremely important. Shoes, belts, gloves, bags, harnesses, scabbards, book bindings, clothing, and countless other objects depended on leather. So the tanner was producing something useful, very useful. Unfortunately, the process of turning an animal hide into leather was not exactly gentle on the senses. Fresh hides had to be cleaned. Hair and flesh had to be removed. The hides were soaked and treated with various substances. Depending on the tanning method, materials could include water, lime, salt, and tannin-rich substances, such as oak bark. The whole process could take a considerable amount of time, and it could smell very much. Tanneries were therefore often located away from the most desirable residential areas. In some medieval towns, regulations attempted to control where such industries could operate because of their smells and waste. The tanner was essentially a person standing at the intersection of craftsmanship and organic decomposition. You took the skin of an animal. You cleaned it. You treated it. You soaked it. You worked it. You weighed it. And eventually you had leather. The finished product was valuable. The process was not. And then there were the people who worked with animals before the tanner ever saw them. Butchers. Now, being a butcher in medieval Europe could actually be a respectable and profitable occupation. Meat was an important part of the urban economy. Butchers often formed guilds or associations, and the trade could be tightly regulated. They had shops. They had customers. They had established places in towns. And they had a rather practical relationship with animals. The medieval butcher was not simply cutting meat in the modern sense. The animal had to be killed, skinned, dismembered, and processed. Every usable part mattered. Meat could be sold, fat could be rendered, bones could be used, hides went elsewhere. Organs could have their own uses. Nothing was wasted if it could be avoided. But the unpleasant part of the work was unavoidable. Blood, offal, wastewater, and animal remains had to go somewhere. This is one reason medieval towns sometimes try to control where butchers operated. A slaughtering area near a clean water source was not exactly ideal. And if you've ever wondered why medieval towns could smell strange, you can probably begin building the answer from this alone. Animals, fires, smoke, leather, waste, people, all packed fairly close together. And then, because apparently the town had not yet accumulated enough smells, you could add a brewery. Brewing itself was not necessarily one of the worst jobs. In fact, it could be an important and respectable occupation. But the medieval brewer had a physically demanding process to manage. Grain had to be prepared. Water had to be heated. Malt had to be handled. Large vessels had to be moved. Fires had to be maintained. And everything had to be done without modern pumps, temperature controls, stainless steel tanks, or automated systems. A brewery was a place of heat, steam, smoke, heavy containers, and repetitive physical work. Beer was also an everyday part of life in many medieval communities. People drank it for pleasure, nutrition, custom, and because water supplies could sometimes be unreliable. But let's not imagine that everyone was wandering around pleasantly tipsy from sunrise to sunset. Medieval beer was generally much weaker than many modern beers, and drinking habits varied enormously by place and period. Still, someone had to make it, and someone had to clean the equipment afterward, which brings us to another medieval occupation that deserves a quiet moment of appreciation. The laundress. Laundry sounds harmless, until you remember that there were no washing machines. Clothing had to be washed by hand. Large amounts of water had to be collected. Clothes had to be soaked, beaten, scrubbed, rinsed, and dried. Depending on the fabric and the period, different cleaning agents might be used, including forms of soap, alkaline substances, or lye. And medieval clothing could be heavy. Wool in particular could hold a great deal of moisture. Imagine taking a large wool garment and trying to clean it by hand. Now imagine doing that repeatedly for other people all day and then carrying wet clothing around. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and often poorly regarded despite being absolutely necessary. Laundry workers were part of the invisible infrastructure of medieval society. Nobody writes a grand poem about the woman who spent 6 hours scrubbing somebody else's tunic. But that tunic still needed to be clean, and somebody had to make it happen. There's something strangely comforting about this. Medieval life was full of famous people. Kings, queens, bishops, knights, merchants, chroniclers. But beneath them was an enormous world of workers whose names have almost completely disappeared. They kept streets usable. They cleaned clothes. They processed animals. They made leather. They carried goods. They emptied pits. They repaired things. They prepared food. They dug. They lifted. They hauled. And they did it again the next morning. And the morning after that. Let's float over to another particularly unpleasant occupation, the executioner. Now, unlike the other jobs we've mentioned, this one carried a very different kind of social burden. Executioners existed because medieval governments and courts sometimes imposed capital punishment. The exact legal systems varied enormously across Europe and across centuries, but where executions were carried out, someone had to perform them, and that person could occupy an uncomfortable place in society. The executioner was often necessary to the authorities, but socially separated from ordinary respectable citizens. In some places, executioners and their families could face restrictions or stigma. The job itself involved considerable physical and psychological demands. And contrary to the image of a mysterious hooded figure silently appearing whenever the king became annoyed, executioners were usually real working people with families, bills, houses, and ordinary problems. They might also have other duties. In some regions and periods, executioners were associated with tasks involving the disposal of bodies or certain unpleasant forms of public work. The occupation could become hereditary. A son might inherit his father's position, partly because other people were reluctant to take it. Imagine growing up in a household where your father's occupation is one that everyone needs, but very few people want to discuss over dinner. You might learn the trade simply because it is the trade available to you. Medieval occupational identity could be surprisingly rigid. Guilds protected some professions. Families passed skills from one generation to the next. Apprenticeships shaped careers. And social expectations could become powerful. A child of a blacksmith might become a blacksmith. A child of a merchant might enter commerce. And the child of an executioner might discover that society had already made certain decisions about their future. Because medieval Europe loved hierarchy. It was everywhere. In the church, in government, in military life, in households, and in work. Some occupations were considered honorable. Others were considered necessary but dirty. Some could bring wealth. Others brought very little. And some could bring both money and social isolation, which is perhaps one of the stranger truths about medieval work. The worse the job looked to everyone else, the more indispensable it could become. The person cleaning the street was doing something the merchant needed. The person tanning leather was supporting shoemakers and craftsmen. The person processing waste was protecting the community from an accumulating problem. The butcher fed the town. The laundress kept clothing usable. The brewer supplied a daily staple. And the executioner represented the authority of the legal system. None of them needed a glamorous job title. They just needed to show up. Tomorrow morning, the town would still be there. The streets would still be dirty. The animals would still need processing. The clothes would still need washing. The cesspits would still be full. And somewhere, perhaps before the sun was properly awake, another medieval worker would quietly begin the least pleasant part of their day. No audience, no applause, just work. And as we drift a little further into medieval world, We'll meet people whose jobs became even more uncomfortable. People who worked around corpses. People who dealt with sewage. People who spent their days underground. People who handled dangerous furnaces. People who climbed buildings without modern safety equipment. And people whose entire careers existed because something had gone very, very wrong with somebody else's body. For now, though, let the medieval town grow quiet again. The bells fade into the distance. The streets settle. The workshops close. And somewhere behind a stone wall, a tired worker finally sits down. Tomorrow, unfortunately, the cesspit will still be there. But for tonight, you don't have to worry about it. You can simply close your eyes and let the medieval world continue without you for a few hours. Hey guys, tonight we continue. Very quietly. The medieval town is still there. The same narrow streets, the same crooked houses, the same little shops opening one by one as morning slowly settles over the rooftops. And somewhere, almost certainly, someone is already dealing with a problem that everybody else would prefer not to think about. Because medieval Europe had a remarkable ability to produce unpleasant jobs, not necessarily because medieval people were unusually careless. Mostly because they simply did not have the technology we have today. There were no underground sewage systems covering entire cities, no electric pumps, no municipal garbage trucks arriving every Tuesday morning, and certainly no cheerful little app reminding you that your trash collection has been delayed by one day. If something needed moving, cleaning, carrying, digging, scraping, draining, or removing, someone had to do it. And many of those people worked quietly in the background. They were part of the machinery of everyday life. We usually remember medieval Europe through its castles and churches. We picture knights, kings, queens, monks, merchants, but most people did not spend their days inside castles. They worked, and some of them worked in places where you probably would not want to spend even 10 minutes. One such place was the medieval sewer, although calling it a sewer can sometimes be generous. In many medieval towns, drainage systems existed, but they varied considerably. Some streets had open channels. Some buildings had drains. Some cities had more organized systems. Others relied heavily on cesspits, gutters, streams, or simply the movement of rainwater. This meant that people had to maintain drainage. And drainage maintenance was not exactly a prestigious profession. Imagine a narrow channel running beside a street. Rainwater passes through. Household waste finds its way into it. Animal waste finds its way into it. Mud accumulates. Leaves accumulate. Straw accumulates. And eventually the channel stops functioning properly. Somebody has to clear it. That person might stand in ankle-deep muck while using a shovel, rake, hook, or other simple tool to remove whatever is collected there. It is the sort of job where nobody notices you when you're doing it correctly, but everyone notices when you stop. The street floods, the smell gets worse, people complain, and suddenly everyone remembers that drainage exists. This is a common theme with unpleasant jobs. They are often invisible when they work. The moment they stop working, everyone becomes an expert. Medieval towns also had to deal with wells. Clean water was extremely important. A town depended on reliable sources of drinking water, and wells could be essential, but wells had to be maintained. They could become contaminated. They could become damaged. They needed cleaning. And cleaning a well could be difficult. Someone had to descend into it. There were no modern harnesses, no electric lighting, no neat little safety inspection. The worker might climb down using a ladder or rope. It was dark, it was cramped, and the air quality inside confined spaces could sometimes be dangerous. People did not understand gases in the modern scientific sense. They simply knew that certain pits and wells could be deadly. This kind of work required courage, even if nobody described the worker as heroic. The medieval world was full of ordinary courage. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that says, someone has to do this, so I suppose I'll do it. And then there were the people who worked underground. Mining was one of the more physically demanding occupations in medieval Europe. Mining existed in many regions and for many different materials: salt, iron, lead, silver, coal in some places and periods, and other useful minerals. Mining methods depended heavily on local geology and technology, but underground work had some obvious problems. It was dark, it was cramped, it was physically exhausting, and the deeper you went, the more difficult everything became. Miners needed to remove material from the earth. They used picks, hammers, wedges, shovels, baskets, and other tools. Water could enter workings. Ventilation could be poor. Tunnels could collapse. And moving extracted material back to the surface required enormous effort. The romantic image of medieval mining might show a rugged worker holding a lantern beneath a mountain. The reality was considerably less picturesque. A medieval miner spent long periods in an environment that was dusty, dirty, noisy, and physically demanding. And if the mine produced valuable material, somebody else was going to become much richer because of it, which was another charming feature of medieval economics. The person sweating underground was not necessarily the person enjoying the wealth produced above ground. Silver was particularly important. It could be used for coinage and trade. Mining regions could become economically significant, but the extraction process required huge amounts of labor. The same was true of salt. Salt is one of those substances we barely think about now. You open a cupboard. There it is, a little container, perhaps with a tiny plastic lid that never seems to close properly. In medieval Europe, salt was much more important. It was essential for preserving food. Meat and fish could be salted. Cheese and other foods depended on preservation methods. Salt was also a valuable commodity and could be heavily regulated or taxed. Salt workers therefore played an important role. Depending on the region, salt could be obtained from mines, salt springs, or evaporating seawater. Salt production could involve enormous amounts of physical labor. Water had to be collected. Evaporation had to be managed. Fuel might be needed to heat brine. Salt crystals had to be gathered. Then the finished product had to be transported. And transportation itself was another unpleasant medieval job. There were porters, cart drivers, pack animal handlers, boatmen, dock workers, and countless laborers moving goods from one place to another. Imagine carrying a heavy sack through a muddy medieval street. Now imagine doing it for several hours. Now imagine doing it in winter. And finally, imagine somebody telling you that the sack isn't heavy enough and asking whether you could carry two. Medieval economies depended on human muscle. Animals helped. Horses, oxen, donkeys, mules, and other animals were essential. But even animals needed people to guide them. Someone had to load the cart. Someone had to unload it. Someone had to repair the harness. Someone had to care for the animal. Someone had to clean up after it. And yes, this brings us back to one of medieval Europe's most reliable sources of employment: animal waste. Cities with large numbers of horses could accumulate enormous amounts of manure. Horse dung could actually be useful. It could be collected and used as fertilizer. It could also be sold. But there was still a great deal of it sitting in streets. Someone had to move it. Street cleaners therefore had a job that modern people rarely think about. They were part sanitation worker, part garbage collector, and part general maintenance crew. Their tools were simple. Their working conditions were not. The street was not just a place where people walked. It was also where animals walked. Carts passed. Food was sold. Water spilled. Waste accumulated. Rain turned everything into mud. In dry weather, dust became a problem. In wet weather, mud became a problem. And in every weather, people remained people, which meant that somebody eventually had to clean up. In some medieval towns, authorities issued regulations concerning street cleanliness. These could include rules about dumping waste, keeping animals, maintaining gutters, or disposing of certain materials. The existence of such regulations tells us something important. Medieval people were not completely unaware of sanitation. They understood that filth could create problems. They understood that blocked drains were bad. They understood that certain waste should not simply be left everywhere. They just lacked the infrastructure and scientific understanding that modern cities eventually developed. And so the burden often fell on individual workers. Let's move away from the street for a moment. Imagine a medieval kitchen. The fire is burning. Pots are hanging over it. Someone is chopping vegetables. Someone is preparing meat. Someone is baking bread. And someone is standing near the fire for most of the day. The cook, being a cook in a wealthy medieval household, could be an important position. Large households needed organized kitchens. Castles, monasteries, aristocratic residences, and wealthy urban households might employ several people in food preparation. There could be cooks, kitchen servants, bakers, brewers, scullions, and other workers. The head cook could even have considerable authority inside the household. But beneath that respectable position was another job, the scullion. The scullion was essentially the person doing many of the dirtiest kitchen tasks. Cleaning pots, washing dishes, scrubbing surfaces, carrying fuel, removing waste, helping with food preparation. It was physically exhausting, and kitchens were hot, very hot. A medieval kitchen depended heavily on open flames. There was no thermostat, no electric fan, no convenient little button marked cool. The workers were surrounded by smoke, steam, heat, grease, and heavy equipment, and they could spend long hours on their feet. The head cook might receive recognition. The scullion probably did not. Yet without the scullion, the kitchen would slowly collapse into a pile of dirty pots. And nobody wants that, especially not a medieval lord who has invited 20 important guests to dinner. Food itself created another set of unpleasant jobs. Fish processing, for example, could be messy. Fish had to be cleaned, gutted, salted, dried, or otherwise preserved. Fishing communities developed specialized skills. Fishmongers sold their products in towns, and the smell of a fish market was probably difficult to ignore. Medieval marketplaces could be crowded and noisy. Different trades often clustered in particular areas. You could find butchers in one section, fishmongers somewhere else, bakers, leather workers, metal workers, cloth merchants, and other specialists. This clustering made economic sense. It also meant that the smell of one trade could become the smell of an entire neighborhood. Imagine walking through a medieval market. You smell bread, then smoke, then horses, then leather, then fish, then something you cannot identify. You continue walking. You decide you don't actually need to know what it was. That was probably wise. Some occupations were dangerous because of fire. The blacksmith is an obvious example. Blacksmithing was a skilled and often respected trade, but it involved working with extremely hot metal. A smith needed to heat iron in a forge, then hammer it into shape. The process required strength, timing, experience, and concentration. The workplace was hot. The air could be filled with smoke and metal particles. The tools were heavy. The metal was dangerous when heated, and a mistake could result in burns or other injuries. Yet, blacksmiths were essential. Almost every medieval community needed metal tools. Farmers needed plow parts. Carpenters needed tools. Horse owners needed horseshoes. Warriors needed weapons and armor. Households needed knives and hardware. So the blacksmith shop was a small industrial center. It was noisy. It was hot. And it never looked especially relaxing. But at least the blacksmith had something to show for work. A useful object, a repaired tool, a finished horseshoe, a blade, a hinge, something solid. The medieval worker cleaning a drain had fewer opportunities to admire the finished product. Their success was simply the absence of a problem. And perhaps that is one of the most underrated forms of work. If the drain works, nobody thinks about the drain. If the street is clean, nobody congratulates the cleaner. If the cesspit has been emptied, nobody writes a song about the person who emptied it. If the kitchen pots are clean, everyone simply assumes they should be clean. This is how much a civilization operates. The less visible the job, the easier it is to forget the person doing it. And medieval Europe was built on people whose names we will never know. Their lives were not recorded in grand chronicles. They did not have portraits hanging in museums. Their birthdays were not carefully preserved. Their letters did not survive in enormous collections. But they were there, every morning, doing work. Sometimes unpleasant work. Sometimes dangerous work. Sometimes boring work. Sometimes all three. And as the day begins to fade over our imaginary medieval town, we can slowly move toward another group of workers. People whose jobs involved the dead. Not because medieval society was obsessed with death. Quite the opposite. Death was ordinary. It was woven into everyday life. And someone had to prepare bodies, dig graves, maintain cemeteries, and perform the practical work that followed a person's death. The grave digger did not need to be a mysterious figure. He was simply another worker. Someone who needed food. Someone who had a family. Someone who had to wake up in the morning. And someone who, when a death occurred, picked up his tools and went to work. The grave had to be dug. The earth had to be moved. The body had to be placed. The ground had to be closed again. Then the worker went home. Tomorrow, another grave might be waiting. And so the medieval working day continued. Quietly, repetitively, without much ceremony, which is probably a good place for us to pause. The town is settling down now. The market is quieter. The workshops are closing. The horses are being led inside. The last carts are disappearing down the street. And the people who spent the day doing the jobs nobody wanted are finally resting. Tomorrow, they will do it again. But for now, the medieval town can wait, and we can let the silence return. There's still many unpleasant occupations waiting for us. Some involve water. Some involve fire. Some involve animals. Some involve the human body. And some involve combinations of all four. But we will get to those slowly. There is no need to hurry. After all, we're not going anywhere. Hey guys, tonight we continue. Slowly as always. The medieval town has settled into another ordinary morning. The bells have rung. The ovens are warming. A few carts are moving through the streets. Somewhere, a dog is barking at absolutely nothing important. And people are going to work. That last part is probably the most familiar thing about medieval life. People went to work. They had schedules. They had responsibilities. They had customers. They had bosses. They had apprentices. They had bills. And they had days when they would prefer to stay in bed. The main difference was that many medieval workplaces were considerably less comfortable than the average workplace today. There were no ergonomic chairs, no air conditioning, no workplace safety posters reminding you to lift with your knees. And if you were injured, there was no modern workers' compensation system waiting to make everything convenient. So tonight, we will continue our quiet walk through some of the jobs that made medieval Europe function. And one of the best places to continue is with the people who work with fire. Fire was everywhere in medieval life. It cooked food. It heated homes. It helped make metal. It baked bricks. It dried materials. It produced light. And it could also destroy things rather efficiently. Medieval people understood fire very well in practical terms. They knew how to control it. They knew how to build hearths. They knew how to maintain furnaces. But they did not have modern fireproof buildings, electrical systems, or emergency services. So working around fire required experience. Consider the charcoal burner. It was an occupation that sounds almost peaceful. A person goes into the forest. They arrange wood. They cover it. They allow it to burn slowly with limited oxygen. And eventually, charcoal is produced. Simple, except that charcoal production required careful control. The wood had to be stacked properly. The covering had to be maintained. The burning process had to be monitored. Too much oxygen could cause the wood to burn away. Too little control could ruin the batch. The worker might spend long periods watching a mound of smoldering wood. There was smoke. There was heat. There was ash. There was physical labor. and there was a constant need to pay attention. The charcoal itself was extremely useful. Blacksmiths needed fuel capable of producing high temperatures. Charcoal worked well for this. So the quiet person standing beside a smoking mound in the forest was connected directly to the blacksmith's furnace in the town. Without charcoal, certain kinds of metalworking became much harder. And without metalworking, many tools became difficult to produce. So once again, an obscure and unpleasant occupation supported an entire chain of medieval life. The charcoal burner probably did not think of himself as part of a grand economic system. He simply had work to do. That is often how history works. People rarely understand that their ordinary day will later become part of a historian's explanation. A medieval charcoal burner was not thinking, one day someone will discuss my labor as evidence of pre-industrial energy systems. He was probably thinking, is this pile burning correctly? Which seems reasonable. Let's move back toward the town. Another occupation connected to fire was the brickmaker. Brickmaking existed in various forms throughout medieval Europe. Bricks could be shaped from clay and then fired in kilns. The work involved preparing the clay, mixing it, shaping it, drying it, then firing it. The kiln needed to reach the correct temperature. Again, there was no digital thermometer. The worker depended on experience. Too little heat could produce poor bricks. Too much could cause problems. And moving large quantities of clay was physically demanding. The brickmaker worked with earth. The potter worked with clay as well. Pottery was one of the most common materials in everyday life. People needed containers, cooking vessels, storage jars, bowls, pitchers, tiles, and many other objects. The potter's workshop could be surprisingly sophisticated, but the basic work was still physical. Clay had to be dug or acquired. It had to be prepared. It had to be shaped. Then it had to be dried and fired. And kilns created heat and smoke. The medieval potter had to understand his material. Too much moisture. Too little moisture. Poorly prepared clay. Uneven firing. Any of these could ruin the finished product. Imagine spending hours preparing a batch of pots and then discovering that the kiln had gone wrong. There goes your afternoon. Possibly your week, perhaps your profit, because medieval manufacturing did not come with convenient undo button. The same problem affected glassmakers. Glassmaking was a highly skilled occupation. Glass required very high temperatures. Furnaces had to be maintained. Materials had to be carefully prepared, and the finished glass needed to be shaped while hot. The work environment could be extremely hot. A glassmaker stood near a furnace while handling molten material. There was little room for mistakes. The profession could be specialized and valuable. Medieval Europe produced increasingly sophisticated glass. Churches, monasteries, wealthy households, and urban buildings could all use glass in different ways. Stained glass became particularly famous in medieval religious architecture. But behind those beautiful windows were workers dealing with fire, heat, molten material, and heavy equipment. The finished cathedral window might look peaceful. The workshop where it was produced was not necessarily peaceful at all. It was hot, very hot, and probably not the sort of place where you wanted to forget your lunch in the oven. Another difficult occupation involved working with stone. Stone cutters and quarry workers supplied the raw material for castles, churches, bridges, walls, roads, and houses. Quarrying stone required extracting large blocks from the earth. Workers used hammers, chisels, wedges, and other tools. They had to split stone along natural lines. They needed skill, but they also needed strength, and they spent their days surrounded by dust. Stone dust could irritate the eyes and lungs. Noise from hammering could be constant. The work was physically demanding, and heavy stones could be dangerous. The mason who shaped the stone was often more visible than the quarry worker who extracted it. Again, the same pattern. The finished building gets remembered. The labor disappears. A cathedral looks magnificent. We admire the arches, the windows, the towers, the carvings. But somebody carried those stones. Somebody cut them. Somebody shaped them. Somebody lifted them. Somebody made the scaffolding. And somebody spent months or years working in conditions that would make modern health and safety officers quietly sit down. Speaking of scaffolding, construction work itself could be hazardous. Medieval builders worked at height. They used wooden platforms, ladders, ropes, pulleys, and temporary structures. There were no modern harnesses, no standardized helmets, no steel safety rails. A worker climbing several meters above the ground was relying largely on experience, balance, and the quality of the structure beneath him. This does not mean medieval builders were reckless. They understood practical safety. They knew that stable scaffolding mattered. They knew ropes could break. They knew it could fail. But their options were limited. The higher the building, the more difficult the work became. Cathedrals could take decades to construct. Some took generations. A mason might begin working on a project knowing he would never see the final building completed. His son might continue the work, perhaps his grandson. The building outlived the workers. That is one of the quiet truths behind medieval architecture. The stone survives. The people who lifted it do not. Let's come down from the scaffolding and return to the ground. Another group of workers had an equally demanding relationship with mud. Farm laborers. Agriculture was a foundation of medieval society. Most people in medieval Europe lived in rural communities. Their lives depended on farming, and farming was hard, very hard. A medieval farmer could spend long hours plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, carrying, repairing, feeding animals, and maintaining tools. The exact rhythm varied by season. Spring meant preparation and planting. Summer meant maintenance and growing crops. Autumn brought harvesting. Winter offered some relief from field work, but there were still animals to care for, tools to repair, fuel to gather, and many other tasks. Agriculture was also deeply dependent on weather. A modern farmer has machinery, forecasts, irrigation systems, fertilizers, and many other technologies. A medieval farmer had experience. Experience mattered enormously. People knew their land. They knew the seasons. They understood which fields were better. They knew which crops were more reliable. But experience could not stop a drought. It could not stop excessive rain. It could not prevent a severe winter. And it certainly could not persuade a hungry animal to stop eating the crop. The medieval farmer therefore lived with uncertainty. One of the most exhausting tasks was plowing. In many regions, heavy plows could be pulled by teams of oxen or horses. The farmer had to guide the plow. The animals had to be controlled. The soil had to be worked to the appropriate depth. This was physical labor, and it was repetitive. Forward, turn, again, and again, and again. There is something strangely appropriate about repetitive work in a bedtime story. The same motion, the same field, the same path, the same season. Medieval life could be intensely repetitive. Most people did not travel hundreds of kilometers every few months. They did not change careers 5 times. They did not spend their evenings scrolling through thousands of photographs of strangers. Their world was usually much smaller, and their work repeated itself according to the calendar. The farmer planted, the farmer waited, the farmer harvested. Then the cycle began again. Of course, farming was not always peaceful. There were disputes over land. There were taxes and rents. There were obligations to landlords or authorities. There were market prices. There were poor harvests. But for our purposes tonight, we can leave the drama outside the farmhouse. The important point is simple. Farming was one of the hardest jobs in medieval Europe because it required enormous physical effort and provided little control over conditions that determined success. And yet it was absolutely essential. Without farmers, medieval cities would not exist. The castles would not function. The monasteries could not survive. The merchants would have nothing to trade. Everyone depended on food. And food depended on people who spent much of their lives working the soil. Another occupation closely connected to farming was the miller. The miller operated a mill that processed grain into flour. Mills could be powered by water or wind, depending on region and period. The technology was impressive. Water mills in particular could harness natural energy to perform work that otherwise required human or animal labor. Useful and expensive enough to matter. But if you walked into a tannery during production, the first thing you might notice was not the quality of the leather. It would probably be the smell. There's a reason medieval towns often pushed tanneries toward the edges of settlements or near waterways. The waste products needed to be dealt with. The smell traveled. The water could become polluted. And nobody wanted to live directly beside a tannery unless they had a very good reason. Yet people still needed shoes. They needed belts. They needed saddles. They needed harnesses. They needed leather containers. They needed countless everyday objects. So the tanner continued working. And once again, an unpleasant profession produced something that everyone else considered useful. That is perhaps the best way to understand medieval work. The jobs we remember are often the ones that produced beautiful things. The jobs we forget are often the ones that made those beautiful things possible. The cathedral had its architects and master masons, but it also had quarry workers. The feast had its cooks, but it also had cleaners. The city had its merchants, but it also had street workers. The leather shop had its finished products, but somewhere nearby was a tannery producing the material, and the household had clean clothing because someone had spent the morning washing it. None of this was glamorous, but it was civilization. Slowly, the sun begins to lower over our medieval town. The blacksmith's fire is still glowing. The mill is still turning. The farmers are finishing their work. The street workers are heading home. The tanners are covering their hides. The potters are checking their kilns. The charcoal burners are still watching their piles. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell marks the hour. The medieval working day is almost finished. Almost, because tomorrow, every one of these jobs will begin again. The same tools, the same movements, the same smells, the same tired hands, and probably the same small complaints. Because even in medieval Europe, people had to work. They simply had fewer ways to make the work comfortable. So let the town become quiet again. The fire soften. The workshops darken. The streets empty. And the people who spent the day making medieval life possible finally begin to rest. There are still more jobs waiting for us, and some of them are considerably stranger, but we can take our time. There is no reason to hurry. After all, the medieval workday has already been going on for centuries. A few more hours can wait. Hey guys, tonight we continue. Quietly, the medieval town is waking again. A pale morning light is spreading across the rooftops. The streets are damp from the night air. A few doors open. Someone carries a bucket. A baker is already working near a warm oven. And somewhere beyond the houses, a farmer is beginning another long day. Nothing particularly dramatic is happening, which is exactly what we want, because medieval history is often presented as a collection of dramatic moments. Kings making speeches, armies marching, castles under attack, nobles arguing over crowns. But most medieval days were not like that. Most days were ordinary. People woke up. They ate something. They went to work. They repaired things. They bought things. They complained about prices. They talked to their neighbors. They got tired. And then they went to sleep. The entire medieval world depended on this quiet routine. And underneath it was a huge collection of jobs that were not especially pleasant. So tonight, we will continue wandering through them. We begin with one of the simplest, the person who carried water. Before modern plumbing, water had to be collected. In rural areas, households might have wells, springs, streams, or other nearby sources. In towns, public wells could be important. Some wealthier households had better access to water than others. But someone still had to move it, and water is heavy. A liter of water weighs roughly a kilogram, so a large container quickly becomes heavy. A person carrying 2 buckets could be moving several kilograms at once, and then they had to walk home, and then do it again, and again and again. This was often part of household labor, especially for women and children, though men also carried water in many contexts. It was not necessarily a separate full-time occupation everywhere, but professional water carriers existed in some cities and periods. They supplied households and businesses that needed water. Imagine doing this for a living. You wake up, you go to the water source, you fill your containers, you carry them through the streets, you deliver them, then you go back. Again, the job is simple, the job is necessary, and the job is exhausting. There is something almost hypnotic about it. Walk, fill, carry, pour, return, fill again. Medieval cities depended on thousands of such small routines, and when water systems became more sophisticated, the people who maintained them had their own unpleasant work. Aqueducts channeled fountains and pipes needed repair. A blocked channel could stop water from reaching where it was needed. A broken pipe could cause flooding. A damaged well could become unusable. Maintenance was always necessary. The medieval world was not static. Things broke, wood rotted, stone cracked, metal rusted, ropes frayed, wheels wore down. Someone had to repair everything. That brings us to another profession, the wheelwright. The wheelwright made and repaired wheels. It sounds rather peaceful. A wooden wheel, some spokes, a rim, perhaps a metal tire. But making a wheel required considerable skill. The wheel had to be strong. It had to remain reasonably balanced. The joints needed to fit. The wood had to be suitable. And the finished wheel had to survive roads that were often rough. A medieval cart could carry a significant load. If the wheel failed, the cart stopped. And if the cart stopped in the middle of a journey, the driver had a problem. So the wheelwright was important, but the work was physical. Wood had to be cut, shaped, bent, or fitted. Spokes had to be prepared. Iron components had to be installed in some designs. The wheelwright needed to understand both wood and mechanics. The finished product was elegant. The process was not particularly relaxing. Another worker who depended heavily on physical skill was the cooper. The cooper made barrels and other wooden containers. Barrels were extremely useful. They could hold wine, beer, grain, salted foods, oil, water, and many other goods. The cooper worked with wooden staves. These had to be shaped and fitted. The barrel had to be strong enough to hold its contents. The hoops had to keep everything together. The cooper had to know how it behaved. He also had to maintain tools and produce consistent work. A poorly made barrel could leak. And nobody wants to discover that after filling it with something expensive. Imagine spending hours preparing a barrel of wine. Then you notice a small puddle underneath. Not ideal. So the cooper's job was not just craftsmanship. It was prevention. Good work meant that nothing happened. The barrel held. The liquid stayed inside. Everyone was happy. And nobody gave the cooper a statue. This is another recurring theme. Good medieval work often produced an absence of disaster. That sounds less impressive, but it was valuable. Now let's move toward the river. Waterways were extremely important to medieval trade. Rivers could carry heavy goods more efficiently than roads. A boat could move a large amount of cargo with relatively little energy compared with a cart, but someone had to operate the boats. The boatman. Life on a medieval river could be physically demanding. Depending on the type of boat, workers might row. They might use poles. They might handle sails. They might steer. They might load and unload cargo. And they had to understand the river, currents, shallow water, sandbanks, bridges, seasonal changes, weather. A river could be calm one day and difficult the next. And boats were not modern vessels. They were wooden structures maintained with hand tools. Leaks had to be repaired. Ropes had to be replaced. Cargo had to be secured. The boatmen lived close to the water, which sounds pleasant until you remember that medieval rivers were often used for everything. Drinking water, washing, fishing, transport, industry, waste disposal. So a river could be beautiful. It could also be somewhat less than beautiful. Still, rivers were essential, and the people who worked on them helped connect medieval communities. Goods traveled, news traveled, people traveled, and money traveled. The boatman was part of a transportation system that stretched across regions. The same was true of the carter. The carter transported goods by land. And medieval roads were not exactly smooth. Some were maintained. Many were not. Rain turned dirt roads into mud. Heavy carts created deep ruts. Bridges could be narrow. Hills were difficult. Wheels broke. Animals became tired. And the journey could take much longer than expected. The carter therefore needed patience. A lot of patience. The journey might take days, sometimes longer. The driver had to care for the animals, check the harness, manage the load, repair minor problems, and avoid getting stuck. A modern delivery driver complains when traffic adds 30 minutes to the journey. The medieval carter might discover that the road itself had become a lake, and there was no alternate route, conveniently displayed on a phone. There was simply another road. Somewhere, probably. Let's drift back into the town. Another occupation was a chimney sweep. Now, chimney sweeping became particularly associated with later periods, and we should be careful not to imagine the stereotypical 19th century chimney sweep walking through every medieval village. But medieval buildings did have chimneys and flues, especially as chimney technology became more widespread. Fireplaces and heating systems needed maintenance. Soot accumulated. Flues could become blocked, and cleaning them could be dirty and dangerous. The worker had to reach the chimney. Depending on the building, this could involve climbing onto roofs or accessing narrow spaces. The job required dealing with soot, ash, and confined spaces. And again, the main reward was that nothing went wrong. A clean chimney reduced problems. A blocked chimney could be dangerous, so someone had to climb up there. Another fire-related occupation was the baker. Bread was one of the most important foods in medieval Europe. Bakers worked with flour, water, yeast, or other leavening methods, and ovens. The work could begin very early. Dough had to be prepared. Loaves had to be shaped. Ovens had to be heated. The fire had to be controlled. Bread had to be loaded and removed. And the whole process had to be repeated. A bakery could be hot, very hot, especially near a large oven. The baker might spend hours in heat that modern workers would consider uncomfortable, and flour dust could fill the air. The baker's work was also physically demanding. Dough requires effort. Large batches require more effort, and medieval bakeries could produce significant quantities. Bread was not a luxury. For many people, it was a staple, so the baker had a responsibility that was larger than simply making something tasty. The town depended on bread. A bad harvest could affect prices. A shortage could create anxiety. The baker therefore occupied an important place in the community. But the workers still had to get up early, very early, before most customers were awake. There is something almost peaceful about imagining a medieval bakery. Before dawn, the street is dark. The oven glows. The baker works quietly. The smell of bread slowly spreads into the street. For a moment, medieval Europe sounds rather pleasant. And then we remember that someone has to clean the oven. Ash must be removed. Tools must be washed. Floors must be swept. And the cycle begins again. No profession escapes the cleaning stage. This was especially true for innkeepers. An inn could be a busy place. Travelers arrived. Horses needed care. Rooms needed cleaning. Food needed preparation. Drinks needed serving. Bedding needed washing. Floors needed sweeping. And arguments occasionally needed settling. The innkeeper was therefore part hotel manager, restaurant owner, bartender, stable supervisor, and customer service representative. And medieval customers were not necessarily easier. A traveler might arrive exhausted. Another might complain about the food. Someone might lose a purse. A horse might break something. A guest might demand a better room. And the innkeeper had to deal with all of it. There was no online review system. But word of mouth mattered. Reputation mattered. An inn known for bad food or poor service might lose customers. An inn with a good reputation could become successful, so the innkeeper had to maintain standards. Which brings us to the stable worker, the person who cared for horses and other animals. This was another essential but dirty occupation. Horses needed feeding. They needed grooming. They needed water. Their stalls needed cleaning. Their hooves needed attention. Their harnesses needed inspection. And yes, there was manure. A lot of manure. The stable worker dealt with it every day. The work could be physically demanding. Hay had to be moved. Water had to be carried. Animals had to be restrained when necessary. And horses could be large and unpredictable. Yet skilled stable workers were valuable. A good horse was expensive. A healthy horse was essential for travel, agriculture, warfare, and transport. So someone had to care for it. And once again, the job that smelled the worst could involve one of the most valuable possessions in medieval society. There was another worker who dealt with animals in a different way. The shepherd. Shepherding sounds peaceful. Fields, hills, sheep, a quiet landscape, perhaps a small wooden staff. It almost sounds like a painting, but shepherding was work. Sheep needed to be watched. They could wander. They could become injured. They could be attacked by predators. They needed to be moved between grazing areas. They needed protection. And in many regions, shepherds spent long periods outdoors. Cold weather, rain, heat, wind, mud. The shepherd had to remain attentive. It was not enough to sit beneath a tree and admire the clouds. Although there was probably some cloud admiration, shepherds also had to understand animals. They needed to recognize illness. They had to manage the flock. They had to help during lambing. And they had to protect the animals. Sheep themselves were extremely important. Wool was one of medieval Europe's major economic resources. It was turned into cloth. Cloth became clothing. Clothing became wealth. So the quiet shepherd standing on a hillside was connected to merchants, weavers, dyers, tailors, and wealthy consumers hundreds of kilometers away. The medieval economy was a chain. One worker depended on another. The farmer grew grain. The miller processed it. The baker turned it into bread. The merchant transported it. The innkeeper fed travelers. The stable worker cared for their horses. The wheelwright repaired the cart. The blacksmith repaired the tools. The cooper made the barrels. The tanner made the leather. The street worker cleaned the mess. And somewhere in the middle of all this, someone was still emptying the cesspit. It was not glamorous, but it worked, at least most of the time. And when it didn't work, people noticed. As evening comes again, the town begins to quiet. The baker closes his shop. The cooper puts away his tools. The wheelwright covers the finished wheels. The stable worker finishes the last feeding. The carter settles the animals. The boatman secures his vessel, and the shepherd begins the slow journey home. The streets are calmer now. The day's noise fades. A little smoke rises from the rooftops. The smell of bread lingers. The river moves quietly beyond the houses. And for a moment, the medieval town almost feels peaceful, which is perhaps the strange thing about studying unpleasant jobs. Once you look closely, they become ordinary. The workers were not constantly miserable. They had friends, families, meals, jokes, arguments, small celebrations. They knew their trades. They became good at them. They took pride in doing certain things properly. A medieval worker could hate his job on Tuesday and still be very good at it on Wednesday. That is not uniquely medieval. That is simply being human. So tonight, as we leave this little town behind for a while, remember the people who kept it functioning. Not the kings, not the knights, not the grand nobles, but the people carrying water, moving barrels, cleaning stables, baking bread, repairing wheels, guiding boats, watching sheep, and keeping fires under control. They did not make history look impressive. They made history possible. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over the medieval rooftops, they will begin again, quietly, slowly, one ordinary task at a time. And for now, the workday is over. The tools are down. The fires are low. The streets are dark. And the medieval town can finally rest. Hey guys, tonight we continue with another quiet walk through medieval Europe. There's no need to hurry. The town is still waking. A few shutters open. The first carts move slowly over the uneven street. A baker has already been awake for hours. A stable worker is carrying hay. And somewhere nearby, somebody is preparing to clean something that probably should never have become that dirty in the first place. That was one of the great realities of medieval work. Things became dirty, and somebody had to clean them. Today, we often separate the pleasant parts of life from the unpleasant ones. We eat food without thinking about where the waste goes. We turn on a tap without wondering who maintains the pipes. We put our clothes in a machine. We flush a toilet. We throw something into a bin. And then we continue with our day. The medieval person could not make the problem disappear quite so easily. Every stage required labor. Food had to be prepared. Waste had to be moved. Clothes had to be washed. Animals had to be processed. Buildings had to be maintained. And bodies had to be cared for. So let's begin with one of the more unpleasant corners of medieval urban life, the butcher's yard. Butchers were important. They provided meat to towns. Their profession could be respectable. They could become wealthy. They could belong to guilds. They could operate established shops. But the work itself involved blood, fat, bones, organs, hides, and animal waste. An animal arrived. It had to be killed. The carcass had to be processed. The meat had to be separated. The usable parts had to be preserved or sold. The waste had to be removed. And the workspace had to be cleaned. This final part was especially important. A butcher's shop could not simply become a permanent pile of animal remains. Regulations in some towns attempted to control slaughtering and waste disposal. This was not necessarily because medieval authorities understood modern microbiology. They did not, but they understood practical cause and effect. Dirty places smelled. Rotting material attracted animals. Waste could block drains. Water could become contaminated. And an unpleasant neighborhood could become even more unpleasant. So butchers often worked in particular areas of towns. Some cities had designated slaughtering places. Others placed slaughterhouses near waterways, where waste could be removed more easily. Of course, putting waste near water created another problem. But medieval infrastructure was often a matter of choosing which problem seemed least inconvenient. There was rarely a perfect solution. The butcher therefore lived in a world of practical compromises. The animal had to be processed. The waste had to go somewhere. And the customers still wanted their dinner. Speaking of animals, another occupation that deserves attention is a knacker. The term and its exact meaning varied by region and period, but the general idea involved people who dealt with dead or unwanted animals. This was not glamorous work. A dead horse, ox, or other large animal was not something you could simply leave in the middle of a settlement. It was heavy. It would begin to decay. It attracted scavengers, and it could become a serious nuisance. So someone had to remove it. Sometimes useful materials could be recovered. Hide, bones, fat, other parts. Medieval economies were remarkably good at finding uses for things. The person handling the remains might therefore be part of a wider system of recycling animal materials. But again, the work carried social stigma. People were often uncomfortable around those whose livelihoods involved death, blood, or waste. And this brings us back to one of the strangest features of medieval society. A job could be necessary and still be considered socially undesirable. The person doing it might be avoided. Their occupation could define their reputation. Their family could inherit the stigma. This did not happen everywhere in exactly the same way. Medieval Europe was enormous. Practices differed from one town to another, but the general pattern appears often enough to be worth noticing. People wanted clean streets. They wanted meat. They wanted leather. They wanted executions when courts ordered them. They wanted waste removed. But they did not necessarily want to invite the person responsible for these things to dinner. Human nature has not changed much. We like the result. We are less enthusiastic about the process. Let's move toward another trade. The dyer. Dyeing cloth was an important craft. Color mattered. It could communicate wealth, status, profession, or fashion. Some dyes were expensive. Others were more common. Different regions had access to different plants, minerals, insects, and other materials. But dyeing itself could be messy. Cloth had to be prepared. It might need washing or treatment. Dye baths had to be prepared. The fabric had to be immersed. It had to be moved. The color had to be monitored. And the worker had to handle substances that could stain everything nearby. The dyeing process could produce strong smells. It also created wastewater. So dyers were sometimes regulated and could be concentrated in specific parts of town. A dyer's hands might be permanently stained. Clothing might become stained. Tools might become stained. The workplace itself could look colorful. That sounds beautiful. But a colorful medieval workshop could also be wet, muddy, smoky, and unpleasant. The finished cloth was worth money. The process was labor. A great deal of labor. One of the more interesting things about medieval textile production is how many people were involved. Someone raised sheep. Someone sheared them. Someone cleaned the wool. Someone carded it. Someone spun it into yarn. Someone wove it. Someone dyed it. Someone finished it. Someone sold it. By the time a wealthy person was wearing an elegant wool garment, dozens of workers might have contributed to it. The final garment could look effortless. It was not, and wool itself created another occupation, the fuller. Fulling was part of the process of finishing woolen cloth. The cloth was treated so that the fibers became more tightly interlocked. Historically, fullers used water, pressure, and various substances to clean and thicken cloth. In some places, fulling mills eventually used water power, but before mechanized systems became widespread, the work could involve a great deal of physical effort. The cloth had to be washed, worked, pressed, manipulated, rinsed, and dried. Some methods involved substances that modern people would probably prefer not to handle. One particularly famous ingredient in traditional fulling was stale urine. Yes, we have returned to the theme. Urine was valuable. It contains compounds that can be useful in certain industrial processes. Medieval communities knew this through practical experience. They did not need modern chemistry to know that collected urine could be useful. People might collect it for various crafts. Fullers could use it in processing cloth. Tanners and other workers had their own chemical methods. So a medieval town had people walking around with containers of urine, which is not a sentence anyone expects to hear during a relaxing bedtime story. But there it is. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that people understood the value. Nothing was simply waste if someone could find a use for it. This principle extended to ash. Ash from fires could be used in cleaning or other processes. Animal fat could become candles or soap. Bones could be processed. Leather scraps could have uses. Wood waste could become fuel. Even human waste could become fertilizer. Medieval economies had to be economical. Resources were limited. Labor was abundant. So people developed systems that used almost everything. The modern world has become much more disposable. The medieval world often could not afford to be. That did not make it cleaner. It simply made it resourceful. Let's move into another unpleasant profession, the soap maker. Soap existed in medieval Europe, though its use and production varied widely by region and social class. Soap could be made from fats or oils combined with alkaline substances. The process required knowledge. Animal fats might be rendered. Ash-derived alkalis could be prepared. The ingredients had to be combined carefully. The resulting product could be used for washing bodies, clothes, tools, and other things. The soap maker, therefore, had a useful trade. But again, the production process could be messy. Rendering fat involved heating animal material. There could be smells, smoke, grease, waste, and the final soap might not look particularly attractive. Modern soap comes wrapped in neat packaging. A medieval soap maker was not selling a little scented rectangle in a minimalist box. They were producing a practical substance, and practical substances rarely arrive with good packaging. Another occupation that could involve strong smells was the candle maker. Candles were essential for lighting, especially in the evening. Homes, churches, workshops, manor houses, monasteries, all needed artificial light. Candles could be made from tallow or beeswax. Beeswax candles were generally more expensive and associated with churches or wealthy users. Tallow candles were cheaper. Tallow came from animal fat. Making tallow candles involved rendering fat. Again, smell. The fat had to be heated. Wicks had to be prepared. The candles had to be dipped or molded. The process was repetitive. Dip, cool, dip again, cool, again, and again. Eventually the candle became thick enough. This was skilled work. A good candle had to burn reasonably well. A poor candle could smoke excessively or burn too quickly. And medieval people needed a lot of them, because once the sun went down, darkness became a serious inconvenience. There were lamps, torches, hearth fires, and other sources of light. But candles remained important, so the candle maker worked quietly in the background, producing little pieces of light for an entire society. Another job connected to light was a lamp maker or oil processor. Oil could be obtained from various sources depending on region. Olive oil was especially important around the Mediterranean. Other oils could come from plants or animals. Lamps required fuel. Again, somebody had to produce it. The medieval night was much darker than the modern night. Outside of town, once the sun disappeared, there could be very little artificial light. Inside a wealthy household, candles and lamps helped. But lighting remained expensive. That meant work was strongly connected to daylight. People did not simply stay in bright rooms until 2 in the morning. There was no bright screen glowing beside the bed. There was no refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. There was darkness, and darkness encouraged sleep. Perhaps medieval people accidentally had better bedtime routines, although they also had bed bugs. So perhaps we should not romanticize it too much. Let's return to the streets. One occupation that often appears in discussions of medieval cities is the gong farmer. The term is especially associated with later medieval and early modern England, and we should be careful about projecting the exact occupation backward into every part of medieval Europe. But the basic job was simple: removing human waste from privies and cesspits. We already met the general task earlier. Now, let's think about what it actually required. A cesspit was not a pleasant place. It was usually underground. It could be dark. It could be cramped. It could contain a mixture of human waste, water, household debris, and other material. The worker had to remove it. Tools were basic. The material might be lifted into buckets. The buckets had to be carried. The waste had to be transported away. And the worker had to repeat the process until the pit was sufficiently emptied. It was dirty. It was physically tiring. And it was probably one of the strongest examples of a job that everyone wanted done, but nobody wanted to perform. In some places, the material removed from cesspits could be used as fertilizer. So the worker was not simply removing waste. He was moving a resource. That sounds strange today, but medieval agriculture operated under different conditions. Fertilizer mattered. Manure mattered. Anything that improved soil fertility could have value. Human waste, however unpleasant, contained nutrients, so it could be useful when managed appropriately. The medieval economy, therefore, had an odd relationship with filth. The things modern people immediately classify as useless waste could sometimes become economically valuable. That is why the person who removed them was performing an important service. The same principle applied to bones. Bone collectors could gather animal bones for various purposes. Bones might be used in crafts. They could be burned or processed. They might contribute to fertilizer. Specific uses vary by time and place. Again, the medieval world tried to extract value from materials. There was little room for waste. The occupation of the rag picker also belonged to this broader world. Old cloth could be collected and reused. Textiles were valuable. A worn garment did not necessarily go directly into the rubbish. It could be repaired, cut down, reused as rags, transformed into another object. In some places, textile recycling became economically significant. A rag collector could gather discarded cloth and sell it to people who needed it. This was a humble occupation, but it reveals something important about medieval life. People reused things because they had to. A piece of cloth represented labor, what had been raised, sheared, cleaned, spun, woven, dyed. That made throwing away simply because it had become old rather wasteful. The same applied to metal. Old metal could be melted down. Broken tools could be repaired. Containers could be patched. Shoes could be resold. Wood could be reused. Buildings could be repaired rather than replaced. Medieval society was not environmentally conscious in the modern sense. It was economically practical. Things were expensive. Labor was valuable. Resources were limited. So people used what they had. And that meant a whole category of workers existed around repair. The cobbler repaired shoes. The tailor repaired clothing. The farrier cared for horses' hooves and shoes. The blacksmith repaired tools. The carpenter repaired wooden objects. The cooper repaired barrels. The wheelwright repaired carts. The mason repaired walls. The roofer repaired roofs. The list goes on. The medieval world was constantly breaking and constantly being repaired. Perhaps that is the real secret of medieval civilization. Not castles, not swords, not crowns. Maintenance. Someone had to keep everything going, and maintenance is rarely exciting, which is perfect for us, because as the evening settles over the town, the workers are finishing their tasks. The dyer has emptied the dye vat. The fuller has finished working the cloth. The soap maker has cleaned the workshop. The candle maker has set aside the finished candles. The butcher has closed the shop. The rag collector has sorted the day's material. The waste worker has delivered his unpleasant load. And the street has become quieter. The town smells like smoke, wet earth, bread, animals, and, unfortunately, several other things that medieval people probably stopped noticing after a while. The sky is dark now. The last customers are returning home. The doors close. The fires are covered. The candles burn slowly. And somewhere in a small room, a medieval worker is finally sitting down after a long day. Perhaps there is a simple meal. Perhaps a little conversation. Perhaps nothing at all. Just tiredness. The kind of tiredness that comes from doing the same physical tasks all day. Tomorrow will bring another day. Another batch of cloth, another animal, another barrel, another candle, another pile of waste, another street to clean, and another ordinary morning in a world where almost everything had to be done by hand. So for now, we can let the town rest. There is no need to follow every worker home. They have done enough for one day, and tomorrow there will always be more things that need cleaning. Hey guys, tonight we continue, very slowly. The medieval town is quiet again. The last candles are burning. The workshops have mostly closed. A few windows still glow softly in the darkness. Somewhere a horse shifts its weight inside a stable. A dog curls up beside a doorway. And in a small house, someone is already asleep. Tomorrow will come soon enough. And when it does, people will return to the same work they have been doing for years. There is something comforting about that repetition. We often imagine medieval life as unpredictable, and in many ways it was, but ordinary work had its own rhythm. People knew what had to be done. They knew the seasons. They knew their tools. They knew the streets. They knew their neighbors. They knew which shop opened early. They knew which road became muddy after rain. They knew which horse was difficult. They knew which one was easiest to use. And they knew which jobs were best avoided if there was any choice. So let's continue with one of the oldest forms of hard work, carrying Before machines could lift heavy objects, people had to do it themselves. There were cranes and lifting devices in medieval construction. There were pulleys. There were carts. There were animals. Medieval engineers were perfectly capable of designing clever machines. But even with those devices, human muscle remained essential. A porter might carry goods from a market to a warehouse. A dock worker might move cargo from a boat. A construction worker might carry stone. A servant might carry firewood. A household worker might carry water. A soldier might carry supplies. And a merchant's employee might spend an entire day moving packages around a busy market. The job sounds simple. Pick something up, carry it, put it down, repeat. But repetition is where physical work becomes difficult. One heavy load is manageable. 100 loads are something else. And medieval cities could be busy places. Markets brought together merchants, craftsmen, farmers, travelers, animals, and carts. Goods arrived from nearby villages and distant regions. Grain, wine, salt, fish, wool, cloth, wood, metal, spices, and many other products. All of these things had to be moved. Someone had to unload the wagon. Someone had to carry the sack. Someone had to stack it. Someone had to load another cart. Then the whole process started again. There was no forklift quietly waiting in the corner. No warehouse conveyor belt. No electric pallet jack. Just people and animals. This made strong workers valuable. It also made injuries common enough to be a serious concern. A back could be strained. A foot could be crushed. A hand could be injured. A worker could fall. And there was no modern workplace doctor arriving with a clipboard. If you were lucky, you knew someone with useful medical knowledge. If you were unlucky, you simply had to wait and hope. This was one of the quiet dangers of medieval employment. Many injuries did not happen dramatically. They happened slowly. Years of lifting, years of bending, years of standing, years of carrying. The body remembered. A person could become worn down long before old age. This was especially true for laborers whose work depended on physical strength. And then there were the people who worked on ships. Medieval sailors had a different kind of hard life. The sea could be calm. It could also be cold, wet, windy, uncomfortable. A sailor might spend hours handling ropes, sails, cargo, or oars. Depending on the vessel and period, ships could have very different designs, but all of them required maintenance. Wooden hulls needed repair. Ropes needed replacing. Sails needed attention. Cargo had to be secured. Water had to be managed. Food had to be stored. And the crew had to work together. A ship was not a place where everyone could simply do whatever they wanted. If the vessel needed a sail adjusted, someone had to climb. If the cargo shifted, someone had to move it. If water entered the hull, someone had to deal with it. And if the weather changed, everyone suddenly became much more interested in doing their job correctly. The sailor therefore lived in an environment where work and survival were closely connected. The sea did not care whether you were tired. It did not care whether your shift was technically finished. If something needed to be done, someone had to do it. Yet there was also a strange beauty to medieval maritime work. A ship leaving a harbor, the sails catching wind, the coastline slowly disappearing, the sound of water against wood for the people doing the work. It was probably less poetic. Their hands were busy, their clothes were wet, and someone was probably complaining about the rope. Still, medieval trade depended heavily on rivers and seas. Without sailors and boatmen, many goods could not travel efficiently. The merchant might receive the credit. The sailor did the moving. Let's return to land. Another occupation that involved long journeys was the messenger. Messengers carried letters, documents, orders, and information. In a world without telephones or instant messages, communication depended on people physically moving information. That alone makes the medieval world feel very slow. If a king wanted to send a message to another city, someone had to carry it. If a merchant wanted to contact a business partner, someone had to travel. If a monastery wanted to communicate with another monastery, a messenger might be required. The messenger had to travel through weather, rain, cold, heat, mud, and sometimes snow. Roads could be difficult. Bridges could be damaged. Rivers had to be crossed. Horses needed care, and the journey might take days or weeks. A messenger therefore had to be reliable. Losing a letter was not like losing an email. There was no copy sitting in a sent folder. The original might be the only version. And if the message was important, the messenger carried something much more valuable than paper. He carried information that made messengers part of the nervous system of medieval government and commerce. They were often overlooked, but without them, decisions moved slowly, even slower than usual. And medieval decisions already moved at a wonderfully leisurely pace. Another worker who spent long periods traveling was the pilgrim guide. Pilgrimage was important throughout medieval Europe. People traveled to religious sites for many reasons: faith, repentance, tradition, hope, community. Sometimes simply because they wanted to see a famous place. Pilgrims needed food, shelter, directions, and protection. So roads developed around pilgrimage routes. In served travelers. Merchants sold supplies. Guides helped people navigate unfamiliar areas. Some guides may have worked locally rather than as a formal profession, but the broader economy surrounding travel created many jobs. And travel itself was difficult. A medieval traveler did not simply check a route on a phone. You might ask someone, follow a road, watch for landmarks, listen to rumors, hope you were going the correct way. A guide, therefore, needed knowledge of the landscape. He might know where a river could be crossed, where an inn could be found, where a road became dangerous after rain, where a bridge existed, and where, perhaps, there was absolutely nothing for several hours. The medieval landscape was full of empty spaces, and empty spaces meant preparation. Food had to be carried. Water had to be found. Animals had to be fed. Travelers had to rest. It was not unusual for journeys to be tiring even when nothing went wrong. And nothing going wrong was already a success. Let's think about another job connected with roads. The bridge worker. Bridges were essential. A good bridge could transform transportation. It allowed carts, animals, and people to cross rivers safely. But bridges required maintenance. Wooden bridges could decay. Stone bridges could develop cracks. Floods could damage supports. Ice could cause problems. Debris could accumulate. Someone had to inspect and repair them. In some places, bridge maintenance was connected to local communities or authorities. In others, specialized workers performed repairs. Again, the worker's greatest success was often invisible. A bridge that remains standing does not attract much attention. A bridge that collapses becomes very memorable. So medieval bridge workers lived in a world where the goal was often prevent the story. They wanted the bridge to remain boring. Boring was good. Boring meant everyone crossed safely. There is a certain dignity in boring work. It keeps the world running. Let's move toward another occupation, the roofer. Medieval roofs varied enormously. Thatch was common in many rural and poorer buildings. Wood, tile, slate, and other materials were also used. Whatever the material, roofs needed maintenance. Rain could enter. Thatch could decay. Tiles could break. Wood could rot. Storms could damage coverings. And someone had to climb up and fix them. Roof work was dangerous. A worker was elevated above the ground. The surface could be slippery. Tools could fall. Materials could be heavy. And the roof itself might be uneven. The medieval roofer had no modern harness system. He relied on ladders, scaffolding, ropes, and his own balance. Even a small fall could cause serious injury. Yet roofs were essential. A leaking roof could ruin everything underneath. Grain, furniture, clothing, food, books, tools. A roof was a building's first line of defense against weather. So the person who repaired it was protecting the entire household. And that brings us to another job that could be unexpectedly unpleasant. The thatcher. Thatch could be made from various types of plant material, depending on local conditions. It was relatively inexpensive and widely available, but it needed maintenance. A thatched roof could deteriorate. Animals might damage it. Weather could wear it down. The thatcher had to climb onto the roof and replace sections. The work required skill. The bundles had to be arranged correctly. They needed to shed water. The surface had to be secure. And the worker had to move carefully. The finished roof could look simple, but a good thatched roof required knowledge. The difference between a roof that lasted years and one that leaked could depend on the craftsmanship. Then there were the people who worked with wood. Carpenters were everywhere. Buildings depended on timber, furniture, doors, windows, roofs, carts, tools, ships, scaffolding, barrels. Almost everything involved wood in some way. Carpentry could therefore be a highly respected trade, but it was also physically demanding. Trees had to be felled, logs had to be transported, wood had to be cut, boards had to be shaped, joints had to be made, large beams had to be moved, and the tools were powered by human effort. Axes, saws, adzes, chisels, planes. No electric saw, no power drill, no automatic sanding machine. The carpenter had to create the object with his own hands. This could take time, a great deal of time, and mistakes were expensive. A poorly cut beam could ruin a structure. A badly fitted joint could weaken furniture. A crooked door could refuse to close properly, which is perhaps one of the few problems that remains completely understandable across 8 centuries. A door that won't close is annoying in every century. The medieval carpenter also had to understand wood. Different trees had different properties. Some woods were strong, some were flexible, some resisted moisture better than others. Seasoning mattered, grain mattered. The carpenter learned through experience. And experienced craftsmen could become valuable members of a community. The apprentice, however, had to learn the hard way. Apprenticeships were common in many crafts. A young person could enter a master's household and learn the trade over several years. The apprentice worked. He watched. He practiced. He made mistakes. He was corrected. And eventually, if everything went well, he became a skilled craftsman. But being an apprentice could mean doing many of the less interesting jobs. Cleaning, carrying, preparing materials, fetching tools, running errands. The medieval version of an entry-level position. In other words, although the medieval apprentice probably had fewer meetings, so perhaps there were advantages. Another craft with a demanding apprenticeship was masonry. We already mentioned stonecutters, but the mason's work deserves another look. A master mason needed to understand measurements, angles, stone types, structural principles, and decorative techniques. A mistake in a decorative carving was one thing. A mistake in a structural wall was another. Large building projects required coordination. Workers needed to know what had to be done. Materials had to arrive. Stone had to be prepared. Mortar had to be mixed. Scaffolding had to be maintained. And all of this had to continue through different seasons. Imagine working on a cathedral for 10 years, then 20, then 30. The building grows slowly. You see one section rise. Another section is finished. A tower appears. Perhaps you become old while the building continues. The finished structure might stand for hundreds of years. Your own name might not survive, but your work does. That is one of the quietest forms of historical immortality. Not fame, not a statue, just a stone that remains exactly where you put it. Now let's return to the countryside. Another unpleasant job was peat cutting in regions where peat was used as fuel. Peat had to be cut from wet ground. The process could be muddy, wet, cold, and physically tiring. Blocks were cut, removed, then dried. Peat could provide fuel in areas where it was scarce or expensive. Again, the worker was turning a difficult natural environment into something useful. The same principle applied to salt workers. We mentioned them earlier, but salt production deserves another quiet look. In coastal areas, seawater could be evaporated. In other areas, brine could be extracted. Salt could then be collected. The work might involve moving water, tending fires, scraping salt, and transporting heavy loads. Salt crystals themselves are not particularly heavy, but large quantities are, and once the salt was produced, it had to be packaged and moved. A salt worker could therefore spend much of the day surrounded by water, heat, and heavy containers. In winter, cold could be a problem. Near furnaces, heat could be a problem. And salt itself could irritate damaged skin. Small cuts could sting. A lot. Medieval workers therefore developed the ability to tolerate discomfort that modern people might find surprising. Not because they were somehow tougher species, because they had little choice. You learned to work with what you had. You learned to use your tools. You learned how to avoid the worst injuries. And you learned that complaining did not necessarily make the load lighter, although people certainly complained. Medieval people complained quite a lot. We know this because their letters, poems, court records, sermons, and other writings occasionally preserve their frustrations. They complain about prices, neighbors, weather, taxes, work, bad roads, unfair employers, and people who behave badly. So the idea that medieval people simply accepted everything without complaint is not accurate. They were human. They grumbled. They joked. They argued. They negotiated. They tried to improve their circumstances. And sometimes they simply went home. As the evening settles over our medieval landscape, the workers begin to disappear from the roads. The porter has finished carrying his last load. The sailor has secured the boat. The carpenter has put away his tools. The roofer has climbed down. The messenger has reached his destination. The bridge worker has finished his repairs. The farmer has returned from the field. And the salt worker has finally stopped scraping crystals from the evaporating pans. The town becomes quiet again. There's a small fire in a house. Someone is eating. Someone is talking. Someone is preparing for sleep. The people of medieval Europe had difficult jobs, but they also had ordinary lives around those jobs. They loved people. They disliked people. They celebrated birthdays. They attended religious festivals. They bought things they probably didn't need. They worried about money. They worried about food. They worried about the weather. And occasionally, they probably dreamed about having a much easier job. Perhaps the porter dreamed of becoming a merchant. Perhaps the apprentice dreamed of becoming a master. Perhaps the farmer dreamed of a better harvest. Perhaps the sailor dreamed of dry land. And perhaps the person who cleaned the cesspit dreamed of literally anything else. That was medieval working life. Not one endless tragedy. Not one endless adventure. Just thousands of people doing difficult things because those things needed to be done. And when the workday ended, they rested. Then they woke and started again. The same rhythm, the same streets, the same tools, the same world. For tonight, though, we can leave them there. The fires are low. The animals are quiet. The roads are dark. And the workers have finally stopped moving. Tomorrow, the medieval world will need them again. But for now, everything can wait until morning. Hey guys, tonight we continue. Quietly, the medieval town is already awake. The morning bell has sounded. The streets are beginning to fill. A cart moves slowly past a row of houses. A baker carries a basket of bread. A woman walks toward the well. A stable worker leads a horse through the street. And somewhere behind a stone wall, another kind of worker is preparing for a task that medieval people understood very well. Death. We have already met some of the people who dealt with animals after they died. Tonight, we will spend more time with the human side of this work. Not because death needs to be made frightening. It doesn't. For medieval people, death was simply part of life. People died at home. They died in hospitals and religious institutions. They died while traveling. They died in old age. They died from illnesses. And sometimes they died suddenly. But whatever the circumstances, Somebody still had to take care of the practical details. Someone had to prepare the body. Someone had to dig the grave. Someone had to transport the body. Someone had to maintain the cemetery. And someone had to make sure the burial could actually happen. These jobs were not necessarily performed by one specialized worker. Practices vary by region, period, religion, and social class. But the work existed, and it had to be done. The grave digger is probably the easiest person to imagine. A shovel, a patch of earth, a quiet cemetery. The work sounds simple, but digging a grave by hand is physically demanding. The soil may be soft. It may be hard. It may contain stones. It may be wet. It may be frozen. And the worker has to remove a large amount of earth. There is no shortcut. You dig. You lift. You move the soil. Then you dig again. The work becomes especially difficult when the ground is heavy or compact. A medieval graveyard could become crowded. Cemeteries were valuable spaces within towns and villages. They had to be managed. Old graves might be disturbed when new burials were made. Depending on local practice, bones could be moved to ossuaries or other places. Again, the exact customs varied widely, but the basic reality remained. There was only so much space. The dead had to be accommodated, and somebody had to manage that space. The cemetery worker therefore performed an important civic and religious function. The grave itself also had symbolic meaning. Burial practices were connected to religious beliefs. Christian communities generally emphasized burial in consecrated ground. Churchyards could become central spaces in medieval settlements. People lived close to the cemetery. They worshipped nearby. They walked through it. They knew the names of the dead. Death was not hidden away in the same way it often is today. A medieval person could grow up surrounded by reminders of mortality. Graves were visible. Funerals were public. Memorials existed. Church services spoke regularly about death. This does not mean medieval people were constantly depressed. They simply had a different relationship with the subject. Death was more visible, and therefore the work surrounding death was also more visible. The person who prepared a body might be a family member, a religious worker, or another person whose role varied by community. The body might be washed, dressed, placed in a coffin, or wrapped according to local customs. Prayers could be said, then the burial followed. For wealthy people, funerals could be elaborate. There might be candles, clergy, processions, tombs, memorial services. For poorer people, the ceremony could be simpler, but every burial required practical labor. Someone carried the body, someone prepared the ground, someone filled the grave, and after everyone else went home, someone still had to finish the work. This was one of the quietest jobs in medieval society. No applause, no ceremony for the worker. The ceremony was for the dead. The worker was simply doing his task. Another occupation connected to death was the grave digger's assistant. A grave was not just a hole. The soil removed from it had to be placed somewhere. The burial had to be coordinated. Tools had to be maintained. The cemetery needed to remain accessible. And after the burial, the ground needed to be closed properly. If there was rain, the soil could settle. The worker might need to return and repair the mound. So even the grave required maintenance. Medieval cemeteries were living spaces in a strange sense. They were not empty places. People walked through them. Children might pass through them. Markets could sometimes occur near churchyards. Animals could wander nearby. Church buildings stood beside them. The dead were physically close to the living, and this closeness shaped medieval culture. You did not need to imagine death. You could see the evidence of it. A name carved in stone, a family grave, a cemetery beside the church, a funeral procession moving down the street. And then life continued. The market opened, the baker sold bread, the blacksmith lit the forge, the farmer went to field. That combination of death and ordinary life was normal. Now let's move to another group, those who cared for the sick. Medieval medicine is often described in very simple terms. People imagined strange remedies, superstitions, leeches, herbal potions, and doctors who believed everything was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. There is some truth in this. Medieval medical theories were very different from modern medicine, but medieval healthcare was also more complicated than the popular image suggests. There were trained physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, monastic infirmarians, barbers who performed certain medical procedures, and many people who used practical knowledge passed down through generations. The work could be difficult, especially for people caring for sick patients. A medieval hospital was not a modern hospital. Hospitals often served multiple purposes. They could provide shelter, food, basic care, religious support, and assistance to people who were poor, elderly, travelers, or ill. Some institutions specialized more strongly in medical treatment. Others were primarily charitable. But caring for sick people was still demanding. Patients needed food. They needed washing. Their bedding needed changing. Their wounds needed attention. The rooms needed cleaning. And caregivers had to work around people who were often uncomfortable, frightened, or in pain. There was no modern understanding of infection, yet caregivers still developed practical habits. They washed things. They cleaned wounds. They used various preparations. They observed symptoms. They learned through experience. Some of the treatments were effective. Others were not. Some were harmless. Some were unpleasant. Some were dangerous. But the people providing care were not simply wandering around guessing. They were working within the medical knowledge available to them. The barber surgeon is an interesting example. In medieval Europe, barbering and surgery could overlap. Barbers already worked with sharp instruments. They shaved, cut hair, and in some contexts, performed minor medical procedures. Over time, certain barbers became associated with bloodletting and other treatments. The familiar red and white barber pole has a complicated history, but the association between barbers and bloodletting is very old. Bloodletting was based on medical theories that were widespread for centuries. The idea was that removing blood could help restore balance in the body. From a modern perspective, we know that this could be harmful in many situations, but the medieval practitioner was not using modern physiology. He was following an established medical theory, and sometimes he had practical experience that seemed to support it. The barber surgeon, therefore, had an unusual job: part hairdresser, part craftsman, part medical practitioner, and often surrounded by blood. Not exactly the sort of job description you would put on a modern resume. Surgeons themselves had to perform procedures without modern anesthesia or antiseptic surgery. Pain control existed in various forms, but was limited compared with modern standards. Surgical work required speed, skill, and experience. A surgeon might treat wounds, remove damaged tissue, set bones, deal with abscesses, and perform other procedures. The risk of infection was enormous by modern standards. Yet medieval surgeons could be highly skilled. They had detailed practical knowledge. They understood anatomy from experience, text, and observation. Some surgical manuals were surprisingly sophisticated. The important thing is to avoid imagining medieval medicine as either completely foolish or secretly modern. It was neither. It was a developing system of knowledge shaped by the science, religion, philosophy, and practical experience of its time. And the people working within it had difficult jobs. Now let's think about midwives. Childbirth was another area where women often relied on experienced female practitioners. Midwives assisted during labor. They helped mothers. They provided practical advice. They understood the stages of childbirth through experience. And they were present during one of the most physically demanding events in human life. The work could take hours, sometimes longer. The midwife might be called at any time. Day, night, winter, summer. There was no convenient appointment. If labor began at 2 in the morning, the midwife got up. She went to the house, and she worked. Midwives could become highly respected in their communities. They carried specialized knowledge. They knew herbs, techniques, signs of complications, and traditions surrounding childbirth. But their work could also be emotionally difficult. They were present when births went well. They were also present when they did not. That is another part of medieval work that rarely appears in paintings. The quiet professionals who stood beside families during difficult moments. Let's move away from medicine. Another unpleasant occupation was the washer of corpses and clothes. Laundry workers have already appeared in our story, but washing after illness or death could be especially demanding. Clothing might be heavily soiled. Bedding might need washing. Water had to be heated. Soap or other cleaning materials had to be used. And everything had to be dried. Without modern plumbing, this meant carrying water. Without washing machines, it meant scrubbing by hand. Without electric dryers, it meant waiting for weather. Laundry was therefore deeply connected to health and cleanliness. People knew that dirty bedding was unpleasant. They knew that washing could help. They might not understand microbes, but they understood dirt, and they understood smell. Sometimes that practical knowledge mattered. The laundress might therefore be doing far more than making clothing look respectable. She was maintaining the basic cleanliness of a household, and in wealthy households, there could be an enormous amount of laundry, bed sheets, clothing, table linens, kitchen cloths, towels. Everything had to be handled manually. The work could be repetitive and physically exhausting. A large household could keep several people busy. The washerwoman might work near a river or other water source. She might carry heavy wet garments. She might beat or scrub them against surfaces. She might use heated water. Then she had to dry everything. Wet wool is heavy. Wet linen is heavy. And large quantities of wet clothing are very heavy. So the job involved a great deal of lifting. It also involved cold water. In winter, this could be miserable. Yet laundry workers continued, because clean clothing had value, and because people preferred not to sleep in yesterday's dirt. A perfectly reasonable preference. Another occupation that could involve water was a tanner. We have already visited the tannery, but its connection to medieval urban life becomes even clearer when we consider what happened to the waste. The tannery produced valuable leather, but it also produced wastewater and organic waste. The materials used in the process could make the surrounding environment unpleasant. So local authorities sometimes regulated the location of tanneries. This tells us something important. Medieval governments were not completely passive. They attempted to manage urban problems. Town councils could regulate trades. They could control where certain activities took place. They could establish rules about waste. They could impose fines. They could regulate markets. They could oversee weights and measures. The enforcement was imperfect, very imperfect, but the rules existed, and the workers had to live within them. A person running a tannery was therefore not simply working alone. He was part of a community. His trade affected neighbors. Neighbors complained. Authorities responded. And sometimes everyone argued. Again, very medieval. Let's drift toward another occupation, the town watchman. This job sounds respectable, perhaps even comfortable. You stand on a wall. You carry a lantern. You watch the streets. But medieval night watch duty could be cold, boring, and tiring. A watchman might patrol streets or stand at a gate. He had to remain awake. He had to observe what was happening. He might be responsible for sounding an alarm. He could watch for fires. He could monitor gates. He could report suspicious activity. But most nights, nothing happened. And that is precisely what made the job difficult. Imagine standing outside at night for several hours. No phone, no music, no podcast, no little screen to check every 30 seconds. Just darkness, wind, cold, the occasional animal, maybe a drunk traveler, maybe someone walking home. The watchman had to stay awake anyway. Boredom can be exhausting, especially when you're supposed to remain alert. And if the town was large, the watchman might patrol long distances. So while everyone else slept, he walked, quietly, again and again. The watchman's work also connected to another medieval danger, fire. Most buildings relied heavily on wood. Roofs could be thatched. Open flames were everywhere. Candles, lamps, hearths, forges, ovens, kilns. One accident could spread quickly. So some towns developed systems for responding to fires. Watchmen could help identify them. Citizens could be required to keep equipment ready. Authorities could establish rules about fires. But fighting a major medieval fire was extremely difficult. There were no modern fire engines. Water had to be carried. Buildings could collapse. Wind could spread flames. The best defense was often prevention, and that meant another kind of worker, the person responsible for maintaining fire safety. Again, this was often not a separate profession. It could be a household duty, a municipal duty, a watchman's duty, a builder's responsibility, but it still required work. Someone had to inspect fireplaces. Someone had to maintain chimneys. Someone had to make sure fuel was stored sensibly. Someone had to react when smoke appeared. The medieval city was a place where fire was both useful and dangerous, and people lived with that contradiction every day. By now, the sun is beginning to disappear. The streets become quieter. The watchman prepares for another night. The grave digger has gone home. The midwife finally rests. The laundress has finished hanging the last cloth. The barber surgeon has cleaned his instruments. The hospital worker checks the patients. The cemetery becomes still, and the town settles into darkness. The dead remain where they were buried. The living return to their homes. Tomorrow, the same work will continue. A new grave may need digging. Another patient may need care. Another child may be born. Another person may need treatment. And another household will need clean clothes. The medieval world was not separated from these realities. They were part of everyday life. Birth, illness, work, old age, death, then work again. It was a cycle, a very human cycle. And perhaps there is something strangely peaceful about remembering that. People thousands of years ago also became tired. They also want to sit down after work. They also look forward to meals. They also wanted warm rooms in winter. They also complained when their feet hurt. They also wanted tomorrow to be slightly easier than today. The jobs may seem strange to us, but the people doing them were not strange. They were simply people living in a world where survival required much more physical labor. And as the final candles begin to disappear, we can let them sleep. The cemetery is quiet. The hospital is quiet. The streets are quiet. The watchman continues his slow walk. Step, pause. Step, pause. The town sleeps. And for a few hours, nobody has to work. Not even the grave digger. Not even the laundress. Not even the person who has to clean the tools in the morning. Morning can wait. For now, everything is still. Hey guys, tonight we continue. Slowly, the medieval night has passed. The first light is beginning to appear over fields. Mist rests above the river. The rooftops are still quiet. A few birds have started making noise. And somewhere inside a small house, a worker is waking up and remembering, perhaps with only mild enthusiasm, that there's another long day ahead. For most medieval people, work was not something they separated neatly from the rest of life. There was no modern idea of finishing a shift, driving home, and leaving the workplace behind. The farm was beside the house. The workshop might be part of the house. The shop could be on the ground floor. The animals lived nearby. Family members often worked together. And if something needed repairing at home, you repaired it. If something needed carrying, you carried it. If the roof leaked, you climbed onto the roof. If the firewood ran out, you found more. There was always something. This makes some medieval jobs difficult to define. A person could be a farmer, but also a carpenter. A merchant might also manage warehouses. A household servant could also clean, cook, carry water, feed animals, and perform countless other tasks. The idea of one person having exactly one job was not always realistic. Still, certain occupations became specialized. And some of those specialized occupations were particularly unpleasant. Let's begin with one that involved a material medieval people could not live without: leather. We have already visited the tannery. Now, let's follow the leather a little further. Once an animal hide had been turned into leather, it still needed to be worked. The leather worker had to cut it, shape it, punch holes, sew pieces together, stretch it, and turn it into something useful. Shoes were especially important. Almost everyone who could afford them needed footwear, but medieval shoes wore out. The roads were rough. The ground was muddy. People walked a great deal, and footwear was constantly exposed to water, dirt, stones, and animal waste. So the cobbler had plenty of work. A cobbler might spend hours sitting in one position, working with leather and sharp tools. The work required concentration. A cut in the wrong place could ruin a piece. A poorly stitched seam could split. A badly fitted shoe could make walking miserable. And there was no convenient trip to a shoe store where you could buy another pair in 10 minutes. Shoes were valuable. They were repaired, patched, resoled, adjusted. A skilled cobbler could therefore be very useful. But the job could also be repetitive. Cut, punch, stitch, hammer, trim, again, and again, and again. The finished shoe was small. The amount of work behind it was not. Another leather worker was the saddler. A medieval saddle was a complex object. It needed to support both rider and horse. It had to be strong. It had to fit. It had to survive long journeys. And it had to be maintained. Saddlers worked with leather, wood, metal fittings, stuffing, and other materials. They produced saddles, bridles, harnesses, and related equipment. The job could be skilled and respectable, but it was still physical. Leather was tough. Cutting it required force. Stretching it required strength. Sewing thick leather was difficult. And the workshop could be filled with scraps, tools, dust, and the smell of treated animal skin. Again, not necessarily unpleasant to the worker. People become accustomed to the environment of their trade. A tanner might not notice the smell of a tannery as strongly as a visitor. A blacksmith might stop noticing the heat. A stable worker might stop noticing the manure. A fishmonger might stop noticing the fish. This is one of the quiet advantages of familiarity. The human senses adapt. What initially seems unbearable becomes ordinary. And perhaps that is how civilization survives. Someone eventually gets used to the smell. Let's move to another job, the fishmonger. Fish was an important food in many medieval communities, especially near rivers and coasts. Religious rules concerning fasting could also increase demand for fish during certain periods in Christian societies. The fish had to be caught, transported, stored, cleaned, sold, and sometimes preserved. Fresh fish could spoil quickly, so fishmongers needed to understand storage. Salted fish could last longer. Dried fish could travel considerable distances. Smoked fish was another preservation method. All of this required labor. And the fishmonger worked with a product that became less pleasant the longer it remained untreated. The market stall, therefore, had to be managed carefully. Fish had to be displayed. Waste had to be removed. Knives had to be kept sharp. The surface had to be cleaned. And the smell, well, there was probably no mistaking the fish market, but fish was food. People needed it. So someone stood there every day selling it. The same was true for the poulterer. Birds were sold for food. Chickens, geese, ducks, and other poultry. The work involved killing, cleaning, and selling animals. Again, not glamorous, but practical. Medieval food markets were places where almost every part of an animal could become a product. Feathers might be useful. Fat might be rendered. Bones might be saved. Meat was sold. Organs could be eaten. Nothing had to disappear. The modern idea of a neat package of meat with no visible connection to the animal itself would have seemed rather strange. Medieval customers knew exactly where their food came from, and somebody had to do the unpleasant work between the living animal and the dinner table. Now, let's think about another occupation, the tallow chandler. We already mentioned candle making, but candle production could become a specialized craft. Tallow had to be rendered from animal fat. The fat was heated. Impurities were removed. Wicks were prepared. The candles were formed. The finished products had to be stored and sold. The process was repetitive, and the smell could be strong. Tallow candles were useful because they were cheaper than beeswax, but they could smoke, they could smell, they could burn unevenly. Still, they provided light, and in a world where darkness was genuine darkness, that mattered. A medieval household might have only a few candles. A church might use many. A wealthy household could burn candles for special occasions. A monastery might need a steady supply. The chandler therefore worked behind the scenes of medieval nightlife. Every candle burning in a dark room had passed through someone's hands. Someone had gathered the materials. Someone had prepared the wick. Someone had shaped the wax or tallow. Someone had sold it. Then someone lit it, and the light made evening work possible. Writing, reading, sewing, cooking, prayer, conversation. For a moment, the candle maker's unpleasant workshop becomes a little more meaningful. A little flame, a great deal of labor. Let's move to another craft where the finished product was beautiful. The parchment maker. Before the invention and widespread use of paper in Europe, parchment and vellum were essential writing materials. They were made from animal skins. The process began with a hide. It had to be cleaned, soaked, dehaired, scraped, stretched, dried, and carefully prepared. The skin had to become smooth enough for writing. This was skilled work. The quality of the parchment mattered. A poorly prepared sheet could be uneven, too thick, too thin, too rough. The parchment maker therefore had to know exactly how to treat the material. And again, the raw material was an animal skin, so the workshop could smell. The work was wet, it was physical, and it required careful attention. The irony is rather pleasant. Some of the most beautiful medieval manuscripts were written on material produced through a process that was probably far less beautiful. A monk might spend months carefully decorating a manuscript. Gold leaf, paint, tiny letters, beautiful borders. And underneath all of it was a piece of animal skin that had been scraped, stretched, and dried. The medieval world had a habit of hiding unpleasant labor behind beautiful objects. A cathedral hid the quarry. A manuscript hid the tannery. A fine garment hid the wool processing. A feast hid the kitchen. And a clean street hid the person who cleaned it. This is why the worst jobs can tell us so much about society. They reveal the infrastructure. They show us what everyone depended upon, but few people celebrated. Let's move into another quiet but difficult profession, the messenger's horsekeeper. A messenger could not travel without an animal. Horses needed food, water, rest, grooming, and sometimes replacement. A relay system could allow messages to travel more quickly by changing horses along the way. Such systems existed in various forms in different medieval societies. When a messenger arrived at a station, someone had to have the fresh horse ready. Someone had to care for the animals. Someone had to clean the stable. Someone had to repair harnesses. Someone had to prepare feed. The messenger got to leave. The stable worker stayed behind. That was often the nature of service work. One person's mobility depended on another person's stationary labor. The same thing happened at inns. The traveler slept. The inn worker cleaned. The traveler ate. The cook worked. The traveler rode away. The stable worker cleaned the stall. Medieval hospitality depended on invisible labor, and invisible labor was everywhere. Let's go back to the countryside. One job that could be unpleasant was the swineherd. Pigs were valuable animals. They could thrive on food scraps and forage. They provided meat and fat. They could be raised in forests or other areas where they could feed themselves. But someone had to manage them. Pigs were intelligent. They were strong. They were not always interested in obeying human instructions. The swineherd had to keep the animals together, protect them, move them, and make sure they did not wander into places where they were unwanted. Imagine trying to herd a group of pigs down a road. It is not exactly the graceful image of medieval pastoral life. Sheep are often imagined moving peacefully across hills. Pigs are somewhat less cooperative. Still, swine herding was an important rural occupation, and like shepherds, swineherds spent much of their time outdoors. Rain, cold, heat, mud. They had to be present regardless of weather. Another rural worker was the goose herd. Again, this could involve supervising animals and protecting them. Geese could be noisy, very noisy. They could also be surprisingly aggressive. A goose is not large compared with a horse, but it has confidence, an unreasonable amount of confidence. The goose herd, therefore, had a simple responsibility: keep the geese where they belong. This was probably more difficult than it sounds. And then there were poultry keepers. Animal husbandry was full of small, repetitive jobs: feeding, cleaning, watching, moving, checking, and doing it again tomorrow. These jobs were rarely recorded in great historical chronicles. No king wrote, "Today, the goose herd did an adequate job." And yet, the goose herd was part of the rural economy. The animal produced food. The eggs were valuable. The feathers could be used. The bird itself could be sold. So even a small flock represented economic activity. Now let's return to the town. Another job that could be unpleasant was a porter at a public bath. Bathing in medieval Europe varied considerably by region, period, and social group. Public bathhouses existed in some places. People did wash. The idea that medieval Europeans never bathed is a modern exaggeration, but bathhouses themselves could be busy environments. Someone had to heat water, carry water, maintain fires, clean rooms, prepare bathing areas, and manage customers. The bath attendant could therefore spend much of the day around hot water and steam. It sounds pleasant, until you remember that all the water had to be heated manually. Firewood had to be gathered. Water had to be carried. Large containers had to be filled. The rooms had to be cleaned. So even something relaxing for the customer could require hard labor from someone else. That is a pattern we know very well today. The customer sees the finished service. The worker sees the preparation. In medieval service, workers did a great deal of preparation. Another occupation was the unstable worker. We already touched on this, but consider the full list. A traveler arrives. The horse needs to be taken away, the saddle removed, the animal watered, the stall prepared, hay provided, manure removed, harness checked. Perhaps the horse needs grooming. Then another traveler arrives. Another horse, another stall, another pile of manure, and the cycle continues. This was not glamorous, but the horse was essential. Without a healthy horse, travel became difficult. So the stable worker was doing important work. The traveler might never remember his name, but he would remember whether his horse was ready in the morning. That was the measure of success. The medieval service economy worked this way constantly. The best worker was often the one nobody noticed. The room was clean. The horse was ready. The bread was fresh. The cart worked. The leather was strong. The roof did not leak. The street was passable. The bridge stood. The message arrived. Nothing dramatic happened. That was success. Let's move toward another job. The locksmith. This sounds respectable, and it often was. But working with locks required precision. Locks were mechanical devices. They had to fit. Keys had to work. Parts had to move correctly. A badly made lock was not useful. The locksmith therefore worked with small components, metal, files, drills, and other tools. The work could be painstaking. A tiny error could ruin the mechanism, and medieval locks were not identical to modern ones. They could be relatively simple or surprisingly sophisticated. The locksmith therefore needed both craftsmanship and patience. The same was true of the clockmaker in later medieval Europe. Mechanical clocks became increasingly important in European towns from the late medieval period onward. Clockmaking required extremely precise metalworking. Tiny gears, weights, escapements, moving parts. The mechanisms had to work together. This was not an easy craft, and if the clock stopped, someone had to fix it. Medieval clocks were expensive. They were symbols of technology and civic importance. Large public clocks could become important features of towns, but someone still had to climb inside and repair the machinery. Imagine spending your day listening to a giant clock mechanism. Tick, move, tick, move, and then one gear doesn't cooperate. So you climb in, you adjust it, you test it, you wait, tick, move. Hopefully, the medieval world was becoming increasingly mechanical, but machines did not eliminate work. They created new kinds of work. Watermills needed millers. Windmills needed operators. Clocks needed clockmakers. Cranes needed maintenance. Machines reduced some physical effort while increasing the importance of specialized skills. This was one of the slow beginnings of a world that would eventually become much more mechanized. But we are still far from factories and engines. For now, medieval Europe remained overwhelmingly dependent on human and animal labor. The afternoon is passing. The markets are becoming quieter. The animals are being returned. The craftsmen are putting away their tools. The parchment maker hangs another prepared skin. The cobbler sorts leather. The candle maker checks the day's production. The stable worker carries one final bucket. The swineherd guides the animals toward shelter. The gooseherd, meanwhile, is probably still negotiating with the geese. The sun lowers. Shadows stretch across the street, and the medieval town begins its familiar evening routine. Doors close. Fires are fed. Candles are lit. Food is prepared. People sit together. Some talk. Some pray. Some simply stare into fire after a long day. And that last image may be the most realistic one. A tired worker sitting quietly. No great achievement. No dramatic story. Just the simple satisfaction of being finished. For tonight we can leave them there. The candle burns. The fire crackles. The street outside becomes dark. Tomorrow the cobbler will stitch again. The parchment maker will scrape another hide. The stable worker will clean another stall. The candle maker will prepare another batch. The fishmonger will open another stall. The porter will carry another load. And the medieval world will continue. One small task after another. Nothing exciting. Nothing sudden. Just work. And work. And more work. Which, strangely enough, is exactly what makes this such a good bedtime story. So let the town grow quiet. Let the last footsteps disappear. Let the candle burn a little lower, and let tomorrow wait. For now, there is nothing left to carry. Hey guys, tonight we continue. With another slow walk through medieval Europe, the evening is settling over the town. The market stalls are closing. The horses are being led back toward their stables. A few merchants are counting coins by candlelight. And high above all of this, on a hill or behind thick stone walls, sits the castle. From a distance, a medieval castle can look almost peaceful. Stone towers, tall walls, a gatehouse, perhaps a flag moving gently in the wind. It looks permanent, almost effortless, as though someone simply built a giant stone castle and then went home. Of course, it was not quite that easy. A castle was a machine made of stone, and like every machine, it required people. Lots of people. Some were soldiers, some were servants, some were craftsmen, some were cooks, some cared for horses, some carried water, some maintained walls, some cleaned rooms, some prepared food, and some spent their entire working lives doing jobs that nobody outside the castle ever thought about. The first person we should meet is the castle cleaner. It is not a particularly grand title. There is no elegant portrait of the medieval castle cleaner hanging in a museum, but someone had to sweep the floors. Castles were large. They had halls, bedrooms, kitchens, storerooms, stables, workshops, courtyards, chambers, passages, and all of these spaces accumulated dirt. People walked in with muddy shoes. Animals moved through parts of the complex. Fire produced ash. Food produced scraps. Straw was used for bedding. Dust settled everywhere. So someone had to clean. The broom was one of the great unsung technologies of history. Simple, reliable, and absolutely necessary. The castle cleaner might spend hours sweeping stone floors. And stone floors are not particularly forgiving. They can be uneven. They can collect dirt and cracks. They can become slippery. And if straw or rushes were used on floors, they had to be replaced when dirty. Depending on the household and period, herbs or other materials could be spread around living spaces. These could help with smell. They could also simply make the room feel more pleasant. But no amount of herbs could completely defeat medieval household odors, because there were people, animals, fires, food, wet clothing, and occasionally a bucket that had been left somewhere it should not have been. So the cleaner worked, quietly, again and again. Now let's go into the kitchen. The medieval castle kitchen was one of the busiest places in the entire household. Food had to be prepared for many people. A great household could have a large staff. The kitchen needed cooks, assistants, fire tenders, people preparing vegetables, people handling meat, people washing dishes, people carrying water, people bringing wood, people storing food, and people keeping track of what had been used. The head cook might have considerable status, but the person feeding the fire had a very different experience. Fire had to be maintained, wood had to be added, the temperature had to be controlled. There was no thermostat, no electric oven, no convenient button marked preheat. The fire had to be understood. Too little heat, and the food cooked slowly. Too much, and something burned. The cook had to learn by watching, listening, smelling, and experience. The kitchen could become extremely hot, especially in summer. Imagine standing beside a large open fire while the temperature outside is already warm. Then imagine doing it for hours. The cook might be sweating constantly. The kitchen workers might carry heavy pots. Some pots could contain large amounts of food. A medieval feast required enormous quantities of ingredients. Meat, bread, vegetables, fish, grains, fruit, sauces, spices, drinks. Everything had to be prepared, and everything had to arrive at the correct time. A noble household could not simply tell everyone, "Sorry, dinner will be tomorrow." The Lord is hungry, the guests are hungry, the servants are hungry, and somebody has to keep the whole operation moving. One of the most difficult kitchen jobs was probably the person responsible for carrying fuel. Wood was essential. A large household needed a lot of it. Fires were used for cooking, heating, lighting, and sometimes industrial processes. So it had to be cut and transported. The woodcutter worked outdoors. The carrier brought it inside. The kitchen worker arranged it. The fire tender kept it burning. The process continued every day. A medieval castle therefore consumed forests in the background, not necessarily irresponsibly in every case. Wood was simply one of the main fuels available, and someone had to gather it. The person carrying firewood probably did not receive much admiration, but without them, the kitchen stopped. The oven stopped. The fireplaces stopped. The castle became cold, and dinner became considerably less impressive. Let's move from the kitchen to the stables. A medieval noble household could own many horses. Horses were transportation. They were status symbols. They were working animals. They were essential to warfare, and they were expensive to maintain. Someone had to feed them. Someone had to groom them. Someone had to clean the stalls. Someone had to inspect their hooves. Someone had to maintain their harnesses. Someone had to watch for illness. This was the work of stable hands and grooms. It was physically demanding. A horse is large. A stable containing several horses produces a great deal of manure. The manure had to be removed. Fresh bedding had to be brought in. Water had to be carried. Feed had to be measured. And the animals had to be handled carefully. A frightened horse can be surprisingly difficult to control. The groom, therefore, needed experience. He had to understand the animal's behavior. He needed to know when a horse was tired, when it was injured, when it was hungry, when it was restless, and when it was simply being a horse. This was skilled work. Yet the groom might still occupy a low social position compared with the nobleman who owned the horse. The contrast was typical. The person who owned the expensive animal received the status. The person who made sure the animal survived received the work. Let's move toward the smithy. The blacksmith was one of the more respected craftsmen in medieval society. But blacksmithing was not an easy occupation. The forge was hot, very hot. The blacksmith had to control fire, heat metal, hammer it, shape it, cool it, heat it again. The work required strength. But strength alone was not enough. Timing mattered. A piece of iron had to be at the correct temperature. Too cold and it resisted. Too hot and it could be damaged. The blacksmith had to listen to the metal, watch its color, feel the hammer, understand the material. The workshop itself could be noisy. Hammer, 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 all day. The sound would travel through the town. For neighbors, it might become background noise. For the blacksmith, it was simply work. And the products were everywhere. Nails, horseshoes, tools, knives, hinges, locks, weapons, agricultural equipment. Without the blacksmith, medieval life would become extremely inconvenient very quickly. Yet blacksmiths also had to deal with soot, smoke, heat, and metal dust. The clothes would become dirty. The hands would become rough. The workshop would become hot, and the work could continue for hours. The blacksmith was therefore both craftsman and industrial worker. A small-scale industrial worker, perhaps, but still. Now let's step outside the castle. There is another group of workers who maintain the surrounding landscape. Gardeners. Medieval gardens varied enormously. Some were practical, others were decorative. Monastic gardens could contain herbs and medicinal plants. Noble households could maintain orchards. Kitchen gardens provided vegetables. Herbs were important. Flowers could be grown. Trees provided fruit. But gardens needed constant attention. Weeding, watering, pruning, planting, harvesting, digging, removing pests, carrying soil, and repairing fences. The gardener spent much of the day bent over ground. The work was quiet. It could also be physically tiring. And the weather controlled everything. Too much rain, too little rain, a late frost, an early frost, a pest infestation, a poor harvest. The gardener could do everything correctly and still lose a crop. Agriculture has always been excellent at reminding people that they are not in charge. The gardener, therefore, needed patience. A lot of patience. A seed does not care about your schedule. It grows when it grows. The same was true of fruit trees. A nobleman could demand apples. The tree might respond, absolutely not. And there was very little the nobleman could do. Now, let's think about another job connected to food. The miller. The miller operated a mill where grain could be turned into flour. Water mills and windmills became important parts of medieval economies. The miller had to operate and maintain complicated machinery. Gears, wheels, shafts, grinding stones. The equipment had to remain aligned. The stones had to be maintained. The grain had to be processed. And the mill itself required constant care. A miller was therefore a technically skilled worker. Yet, millers sometimes had a mixed reputation. There were concerns about whether millers took too much grain as payment, whether flour was measured honestly, whether customers were treated fairly. Not every miller was dishonest, of course, but the stereotype became strong enough to survive in literature and popular culture. The miller could become the medieval equivalent of the person everyone suspects of charging an extra fee, perhaps unfairly, perhaps not. Either way, the job mattered. Without the miller, turning grain into flour was much more laborious. Hand mills existed, but larger mills could process far greater quantities. The mill, therefore, represented one of the ways medieval technology reduced human effort. Instead of someone grinding grain by hand for hours, The power of moving water or wind could do much of the work. The miller still had to supervise everything. Machines do not eliminate responsibility. They simply give you different things to worry about. Let's float over to another medieval worker, the brewer. Beer was an important beverage in many parts of medieval Europe. The brewing process required grain, water, yeast, and often hops or other flavoring ingredients, depending on time and place. The grain had to be prepared, water heated, the ingredients combined, the mixture managed carefully, and the finished drink stored. Brewing could be done at household level, but professional brewers also existed. Large-scale brewing required organization and a great deal of fuel. Water had to be heated, containers cleaned, ingredients moved, finished beer stored. The brewer had to understand timing, temperature, ingredients, and fermentation. Again, practical knowledge mattered. The medieval brewer did not have modern laboratory equipment, but generations of experience could produce surprisingly consistent results. The brewery itself could be warm, wet, sticky, and full of smells, yet the finished product was popular, so the brewer could be respected. This gives us another useful lesson. A job could be unpleasant while the product is beloved. The worker experiences the process. The customer experiences the result. That difference appears again and again. Let's move toward another occupation, the baker. The baker had one of the most important jobs in town. Bread was a major part of the medieval diet. The baker started early, very early, before most people were awake. The bakery could already be active. Flour had to be prepared, dough mixed, bread shaped, ovens heated, loaves baked, and then everything had to be sold. The oven itself required fuel. Wood had to be burned until the correct heat was reached. The baker had to judge the temperature. Too hot, the bread burns. Too cool, the bread remains undercooked. There was no digital thermometer. The baker learned through experience. The appearance of the oven, the heat of the walls, the timing, the behavior of the dough, the smell of the bread, all of these clues mattered. And because bread was such an important food, bakers could face regulations. Weights and prices might be controlled. Authorities wanted to ensure that bread was sold at reasonable standards. This was serious business. If bread became too expensive, ordinary people noticed. If the loaves became too small, people noticed. If the quality declined, people definitely noticed. Medieval customers could be remarkably interested in the size of their bread, understandably. So the baker had a difficult combination: physical work, early mornings, hot ovens, and customers who were paying close attention. Not exactly a relaxing career, although the smell of fresh bread probably helped. Let's now visit another group, the people who worked with water. Water carriers were important in places without convenient household access to wells or other sources. A water carrier might collect water and transport to homes or businesses. The containers were heavy. Water itself is heavy. A bucket can feel manageable. Several buckets, carried repeatedly throughout the day, are another matter. And the worker had to walk, perhaps across uneven streets, perhaps upstairs, perhaps through crowded markets, then return for more. Again and again, the household received clean water. The carrier received the physical burden. In some cities, wells and fountains reduced the distance. But not everyone lived next to a water source. And even when water was nearby, it still had to be lifted. The person who pulled the bucket from the well performed a small but essential task. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, cleaning, animals, crafts, construction, everything. The medieval city could not function without it, so the water carrier was part of the city's hidden infrastructure. The same could be said of the people who maintained wells. A well needed cleaning. The surrounding area needed protection. The structure had to be repaired. If the rope broke, someone replaced it. If the bucket broke, someone fixed it. If the well became contaminated, people had a serious problem. Water management was not glamorous, but it was fundamental. And the people responsible for it were performing one of the oldest public services in human history. As night returns, the castle becomes quieter. The kitchens are almost finished. The horses are resting. The mill is slowing down. The bakery is dark. The well is quiet. The workers are finally leaving their posts. The blacksmith has extinguished the forge. The gardener has gone inside. The brewer has covered the vats. The stable worker has finished his final round. And somewhere beneath the great stone walls, a servant is sweeping a corridor that will somehow become dirty again tomorrow. That is the nature of work. You clean, it gets dirty. You repair, it breaks. You carry, there is more to carry. You cook, someone eats. You wash the dishes. Someone uses another plate. And so the cycle continues. It can sound exhausting, and it was. But there's also something strangely peaceful about repetition. The medieval worker knew what tomorrow looked like. There was comfort in familiar tools, familiar streets, familiar tasks, a world that changed slowly, a world where a person might spend an entire life learning one craft. We sometimes imagine the past as chaotic, but most of it was probably quite ordinary. People woke up. They worked. They ate. They talked. They complained. They rested. Then they did it again. And again. And again. So let the castle settle into silence. The great doors are closed. The animals are sleeping. The last fire in the kitchen is glowing softly. The bakery is dark. The mill will have slowed. The well stands quietly beneath the moonlight. And the workers, at least for a few hours, are finished. Tomorrow, the worst jobs will still be waiting. But tonight they can wait. For now, the town is quiet. The castle is quiet. And the medieval world can finally rest. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the last quiet walk through medieval Europe. The streets are almost empty now. The moon hangs above the rooftops. A few candles glow behind wooden shutters. The castle stands quietly on the hill. The workshops are closed. The market is silent. And after all the unpleasant jobs we have visited, there is one final thing worth remembering. Medieval Europe did not run on kings. It did not run on castles. It did not run on knights. At least, not by themselves. It ran on ordinary people doing ordinary work, often difficult work, often repetitive work, and sometimes work that nobody wanted to talk about. Someone had to clean the streets. Someone had to carry water. Someone had to feed the horses. Someone had to bake the bread. Someone had to dig the graves. Someone had to repair the roof. Someone had to wash the clothes. Someone had to remove the waste. Someone had to sharpen the tools. Someone had to grind the grain. And someone had to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. That is where we will end our journey. Not with a king, not with a battle, not with a dramatic ending, just with work. Because, honestly, work is what most of history was. The great chronicles might spend pages describing a royal wedding. They might tell us which noble family received which estate. They might carefully record the name of a prince. But somewhere nearby, a woman was washing clothes. A man was repairing a cart. A child was carrying a bucket. A farmer was checking his animals. A baker was preparing dough. And none of them had a chronicler standing beside them. They were simply getting on with the day. Let's imagine one ordinary medieval town one final time. The morning begins slowly. The baker is awake before everyone else. The fire needs to be prepared. The dough needs attention. The first loaves begin to bake. The smell travels through the street. A few people are already awake. A stable worker opens the doors. The horses begin moving. Fresh straw is brought in. Water is carried. Manure is removed. A porter arrives at the market. A merchant's goods need unloading. The porter lifts one sack. Then another. Then another. Nobody applauds. There is no metal. The sack simply needs to move. So he moves it. Nearby, the blacksmith lights the forge. The fire grows. The tools are arranged. The first piece of metal is heated. Hammer. Turn. Hammer. Turn. The rhythm begins. Down the street, a cobbler opens a shop. He sits, takes up a piece of leather, and begins stitching. The work is quiet, almost meditative. The needle moves through the leather. Again and again. The finished shoe will probably be worn by someone who never thinks about the person who made it. That is one of the strange things about civilization. The more successful the system becomes, the less visible the labor becomes. You see the bread. You do not see the baker waking before sunrise. You see the castle. You do not see the people carrying the stones. You see the manuscript. You do not see the person who prepared the parchment. You see the fine clothing. You do not see the people who processed the wool. You see the clean room. You do not see the person who swept it. Medieval Europe was built this way, layer by layer, task by task, person by person. And many of the people doing the hardest work were not powerful. They had little political influence. They did not own castles. They did not command armies. Their names were often forgotten, but their work survived. A bridge built by anonymous workers might stand for centuries. A road maintained by unknown laborers might become part of a town's permanent landscape. A roof repaired by a carpenter might protect generations of families. A pair of shoes might carry someone across hundreds of miles. A manuscript prepared by several different craftspeople might survive in a library long after everyone involved had disappeared. This is perhaps the quietest kind of historical legacy. You do something useful, someone else benefits, and eventually nobody remembers who did it. But the thing remains. Let's think about the medieval baker one last time. He wakes early, perhaps before the sun. The oven is heated, the dough is prepared, the bread is baked, the loaves are sold, people eat, and tomorrow the same thing happens. There is nothing particularly dramatic about it, and that is exactly the point. History is often taught through unusual events. Wars, kings, plagues, revolutions, conquests, but ordinary life has a much slower rhythm. Most people were not involved in famous events. They were working. They were raising children. They were repairing things. They were trying to earn enough money. They were trying to survive a bad harvest. They were trying to keep their animals healthy. They were trying to make it through winter. And they were trying, as people always do, to have a reasonably comfortable evening. The medieval worker was not thinking about being medieval. That sounds obvious, but it matters. Nobody woke up and said, "Good morning. I am now living in the Middle Ages." They simply lived. The world around them was normal. The tools were normal. The streets were normal. The smells were normal. The jobs were normal. A modern person might find some of those jobs unbearable. The medieval worker might find our modern jobs strange. Imagine explaining to a medieval blacksmith that centuries later people would spend 8 hours sitting inside a building staring at glowing rectangles. He might wonder what happened to humanity, and then perhaps ask how much it pays. Because some things are universal. Now the sun is going down. The market is closing. The last customers are leaving. The porter has carried his final load. The fishmonger is cleaning the stall. The butcher is washing the work surface. The stable worker is making one last check. The baker has finished selling today's bread. The blacksmith is letting the forge cool. The cobbler puts away his tools. The miller checks the machinery. The gardener gathers his tools. The washerwoman folds the final pieces of clothing. The water carrier returns with the last bucket. The grave digger leaves the cemetery. And slowly, the town becomes quiet. A candle appears in one window. Then another. Someone closes a wooden door. A dog settles down. A horse moves inside its stall. The smell of cooking drifts through the street. For a moment, the entire medieval town feels almost peaceful. And perhaps it was. The past was not constantly miserable. This is another important thing to remember. People laughed. They celebrated. They enjoyed good meals. They attended festivals. They listened to music. They told stories. They fell in love. They got married. They argued with their neighbors. They bought things they did not strictly need. They complained about the weather. They complained about taxes. They complained about prices. They complained about work. Basically, they were people. The jobs may have been harder. The technology was different. The world was less comfortable. But human nature was still remarkably familiar. A worker finishing a difficult day, probably one of the same basic things people want now. Food, warmth, rest, company, a little peace, and perhaps a good night's sleep. So tonight, we have traveled through the unpleasant side of medieval work. We have met the people who handled waste, the people who processed animal hides, the people who cleaned streets, the people who carried water, the people who dug graves, the people who cared for animals, the people who worked beside hot furnaces, the people who washed clothing, the people who prepared food, the people who maintained roads and bridges, the people who repaired buildings, the people who kept castles functioning, and the people who made sure that ordinary life could continue. Their work was not glamorous, but it was necessary, and perhaps that makes it more interesting, because history is not only about the people who sat on thrones. It is also about the people who cleaned underneath them. A king could own a magnificent castle, but someone still had to sweep the floor. A noble woman could wear beautiful clothing, but someone had to spin the thread. A wealthy merchant could enjoy a feast, but someone had to prepare the food. A knight could ride a magnificent horse, but someone had to clean the stable. A monk could write a beautiful manuscript, but someone had to prepare the parchment. Everyone depended on someone else. That was true then. It is true now. Civilization is basically a very complicated arrangement of people doing things for other people. Some of those things are impressive. Some are boring. Some are unpleasant. And some are so ordinary that we barely notice them. But remove them, and the entire system begins to wobble. That is why the worst jobs matter. They reveal the hidden machinery of everyday life. They show us the things people needed before comfort became invisible. Clean water, food, clothing, shelter, transportation, light, waste removal, repair, care, burial. Everything required someone, and that someone had to wake up the next morning. So perhaps we can leave medieval Europe with that thought. Not the image of a king standing on a balcony, not a knight raising a sword, not a dramatic castle under storm clouds. Instead, picture a small workshop, a tired worker sitting beside a dying fire. His tools are on the table. His hands are worn from the day's work. Outside, the street is quiet. There is nothing left to do tonight. The tools can wait. The orders can wait. The customers can wait. Morning will come soon enough. For now, the worker lies down. The room becomes dark. The town becomes silent. And another ordinary person disappears into sleep, just as millions of ordinary people did before him. And perhaps that is where our story should end. Quietly, without drama, because after all, this is a boring sleeping story. The medieval world has finally gone to bed. The baker is asleep. The blacksmith is asleep. The porter is asleep. The stable worker is asleep. The washerwoman is asleep. The miller is asleep. The grave digger is asleep. Even the castle servants are finally asleep. The candles grow smaller. The fires become embers. The moon moves slowly across the sky. And for a few peaceful hours, nobody needs anything. No one needs another sack carried. No horse needs another bucket of water. No street needs sweeping. No roof needs repairing. No bread needs baking. No grave needs digging. The work can wait. The town can wait. History can wait. So dim the lights. Let the room become quiet. Let your thoughts slow down. And somewhere very far away, in a medieval town that disappeared centuries ago, the last candle goes out. The street is completely still. The castle is silent. The workshops are dark. And the people who spent their days doing the jobs nobody wanted are finally resting. Good night. And thank you for taking this slow walk through medieval Europe.